Picture the year 1200. If you looked at a map of the world's great powers, you'd see the Song dynasty in China, with its silk cities and gunpowder workshops. You'd see the Islamic world stretching from Persia to Egypt, wealthy beyond imagination. You'd see European kingdoms slowly clawing their way out of centuries of fragmentation. And somewhere up north, scattered across a windswept grassland most of these civilized empires barely thought about, you'd find a patchwork of nomadic tribes, herders, people who lived in felt tents and moved with their animals season to season. No cities, no writing system of their own, yet no standing armies to speak of. Just tribes often fighting each other more than anyone else. And yet within 70 years the descendants of those same tribes would control the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known, stretching from the Pacific coast of Korea to the banks of the Danube River in Europe. An empire so vast that a merchant could, in theory, walk from Beijing to Baghdad and sleep safely every night under the same political authority. How does that happen? How do people with no cities conquer people who'd been building cities for thousands of years? That's the question we're going to sit with tonight. Tonight, we're covering the entire rise and fall of the Mongol Empire, starting in 1206, when a man named Temujin was declared Genghis Khan on the open steppe, all the way through 1368, when his descendants finally lost their grip on China. We'll move slowly and chronologically, one turning point at a time, meeting the Khans, the generals, the cities that fell, and the ones that somehow didn't. No rushing. Just a long, calm walk through one of history's strangest and most consequential stories. Before we go further, if you're listening to fall asleep, that's exactly what this is built for. So tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right there. I read these, and it's honestly one of my favourite parts of doing this. Someone's drifting off in Sydney at sunrise, while someone else is just closing their eyes in Chicago at midnight. All listening to the same story at the same moment. Kind of nice to think about. And if you'd rather have this without ads interrupting or music layered underneath, I'm also on Spotify now. Just search the show there, links in the description. It's ad-free, music-free, and honestly it helps keep this whole thing going, so I'd appreciate you following along there too. Now, back to the steppe. Because there are real mysteries buried in this story. How did a handful of tribes with no metallurgy industry to speak of build the most effective military machine of the medieval world? What was it about Mongol horses, Mongol bows, Mongol discipline that let armies of maybe 100,000 men conquer empires with populations in the tens of millions? And maybe more puzzling, if this empire was so effective at conquering, why did it fracture so quickly? Why did brothers turn against brothers, cousins against cousins, within a single generation of unity? We'll get to all of it, but like most great stories, this one doesn't start with conquest. It starts with a boy, alone on the steppe, whose father was murdered before he was old enough to understand what that meant. Picture the Mongolian steppe around 1160. Not one nation, not even close. Instead, imagine dozens of tribes and clans scattered across an ocean of grass, each one built around bloodlines, herds, and grazing rights that shifted with the seasons. Mongols, Tatars, Kerites, Naimans, Merkits. These weren't just different names for the same people. They were often bitter rivals, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, who'd switch sides within a single generation, depending on who offered the better deal, or who'd wronged whose grandfather. Loyalty on the steppe wasn't abstract. It was personal, transactional, and often temporary. There was no single ruler over all of this. No steppe-wide government. No shared law beyond old customs about hospitality, revenge, and the proper way to divide plunder. Confederations rose when a strong leader could convince enough clans that following him was safer than fighting him. And confederations collapsed just as fast, the moment that leader died or showed weakness. It was a world of shifting alliances layered on top of shifting alliances, kind of like watching sand dunes reform after every windstorm. You could never quite predict the shape the desert would take next. Into this world, sometime around 1162, a boy named Temujin was born. His father, ÖGedei, was a minor chieftain, not a great Khan, just a man with enough warriors and enough horses to matter locally. According to the sources we have, which come mostly from a text written decades later, called The Secret History of the Mongols, ÖGedei named his newborn son after a rival Tatar chief he'd just defeated in battle. A kind of trophy naming, and maybe a small omen of the complicated relationship this child would have with enemies for the rest of his life. But here's where things turn hard and fast. When Temujin was still a boy, maybe 9 years old, his father was poisoned by Tatars during what was supposed to be a peaceful meal. Steppe custom said hospitality was sacred. ÖGedei apparently trusted that custom just enough to eat what was offered. He didn't survive the journey home, and with his death everything Temujin's family had built simply evaporated. The clan that had followed ÖGedei abandoned his widow and children almost immediately. No loyalty payments due to a woman and a handful of kids who couldn't offer protection or plunder. They took the herds, they took the followers, and they left the family to survive on roots, fish, and whatever small game they could catch on the open plain. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something important about how fragile status was on the steppe. One day you're the son of a chieftain, the next day you're foraging for marmots because nobody owes you anything anymore. Rank didn't come from birth alone, it came from what you could currently offer, and a widow with young children could offer very little. Temujin's early years, then, were defined by scarcity and betrayal, long before they were defined by conquest. There are stories, again from the secret history, about Temujin killing his own half-brother in a dispute over food, a stark illustration of just how desperate things had become inside that abandoned household. Whether that story is precisely accurate or shaped later to explain his ruthlessness, it's hard to say for certain. But it fits a pattern we see again and again in his early life. Hardship followed by decisions that were harsh, sometimes brutal, but aimed at survival. He was also, at one point, captured and enslaved by a rival clan, forced to wear a wooden collar, and he escaped, according to tradition, with help from a sympathetic family who hid him. Small acts of kindness like this seem to recur throughout his youth, almost as if the steppe itself was testing which relationships could be trusted and which couldn't. And this matters because trust, or the careful engineering of trust, would eventually become one of Temujin's greatest political tools. Two relationships in particular shaped his rise more than almost anything else. The first was with a man named Jamuka, a childhood friend, described as his Anda, a sworn blood brother. They'd exchanged gifts as boys, hunted together, and for a time as young men they rode together, building a shared following. Some of the sources even suggest a closeness that went beyond typical friendship, though the exact nature of it remains debated among historians. What we do know is that Jamuka would later become Temujin's most serious rival, the two of them splitting apart over questions of leadership style. Jamuka favoured the old aristocratic order, rank determined by birth. Temujin increasingly favoured loyalty and ability over bloodline, promoting capable men regardless of their clan origin. That difference in philosophy would eventually put them on opposite sides of the battlefield. The second key relationship was with Togrul, also known as Wang Khan, the powerful leader of the Kherate Confederation. Togrul had once been an ally of Temujin's father, and Temujin worked to renew that old bond, offering gifts, offering loyalty, essentially positioning himself as something like an adopted son. This alliance mattered enormously. It gave Temujin protection, resources, and legitimacy at a time when he had almost none of his own. For years, Temujin fought alongside Togrul, helping him defeat rivals, building military experience, and slowly gathering his own followers under the umbrella of the more powerful Khan. But like most steppe alliances, this one wouldn't last forever either. Eventually, Temujin's growing power would make him a threat rather than a useful subordinate, and that relationship too would end in betrayal and war. Now, all of this political manoeuvring happened against the backdrop of steppe warfare, and it's worth understanding just what that actually meant. Mongol boys were put on horseback almost as soon as they could walk, some sources say as early as age 3, learning to ride before they could reliably speak in full sentences. Riding wasn't a skill you practiced, it was simply how you existed. Alongside riding came the bow, a powerful recurve design that could be fired accurately from a moving horse, at a full gallop, in almost any direction, including backward over the shoulder at a pursuing enemy. This combination, mounted archery, meant Mongol warriors could strike, retreat, and strike again without ever engaging in the kind of close, static combat that exhausted armies from settled civilizations. Mobility was everything. A Mongol warrior typically travelled with several horses, rotating them to avoid exhausting any single animal, which meant armies could cover distances that seemed almost impossible to outsiders. And intelligence gathering, scouts, spies, merchants who doubled as informants, was baked into how these tribes operated long before Temujin ever built an empire. Knowing where the enemy was, how many they numbered, and what resources lay ahead wasn't a luxury. It was survival. What set Temujin apart, though, wasn't just skill with a bow or a horse. Plenty of steppe warriors had that. What set him apart was something harder to quantify, a kind of charisma paired with a genuinely new idea about loyalty. He began rewarding followers based on merit and personal allegiance to him, rather than clan bloodline, which meant a talented warrior from a minor family could rise just as high as one born into steppe nobility. That single shift merit over birthright would let him pull together warriors from clans that had been enemies for generations, all bound not by ancient blood ties but by loyalty to one man's growing reputation. By his early 40s, after years of shifting alliances, betrayals, small victories, and painful setbacks, Temujin had done something almost nobody on the steppe had managed before. He'd begun uniting rival tribes under a single banner, not through inherited right, but through reputation earned the hard way. One battle, one broken alliance, one act of unexpected loyalty at a time. And that reputation was about to reach a turning point nobody, not Jamukha, not Togrul, could have fully anticipated. By the early 1200s, the steppe was tired of endless revenge cycles that never quite ended, tired of raids that brought short-term loot and long-term insecurity, tired of watching promising confederations rise, burn bright for a decade, and then implode the moment a leader slipped. Temujin had spent decades fighting in that world, losing and rebuilding, making and breaking alliances, watching friends become enemies, and enemies become followers. By the time he finally crushed Jamukha's coalition and scattered the last serious opposition, something new was in the air. Not peace. The steppe never offered that. But a sense that the wheel of chaos might, just might, be forced into a new pattern. The moment we usually point to is the year 1206. Somewhere along the Onon River, in a place the sources don't agree on exactly, the leading chiefs, nobles, and commanders of the Mongol world gathered. This was a Kurultai, a grand council, something the steppe had seen before. You called one when big decisions had to be made, picking a leader, declaring a major war, settling disputes too large for one clan to solve. But this particular Kurultai was different in scale and in consequence. Temujin was no longer just a clever upstart. He had proved over and over that he could win battles, protect his followers, and punish betrayal. The rivals who might have credibly opposed him were either dead, absorbed, or reduced to marginal players. So when the assembled leaders raised him up and acclaimed him with a new title, they weren't just choosing another tribal Khan. They called him Genghis Khan, usually rendered in English as Genghis Khan. What exactly that title meant is still debated. Some scholars think it meant something like universal ruler or oceanic Khan, suggesting a power as vast and unbounded as the sea. Others see it more modestly as a formalization of Great Khan, first among Khans. But politically and symbolically, the message was clear enough to everyone present. This was not just Temujin of one clan or one tribe. This was a man claiming authority over all the Mongols, and increasingly over anyone who chose to live under his protection. The Kurultai didn't just hand him a title and go home. It marked the start of a deliberate restructuring of steppe society. Instead of letting old clan units remain the basic building blocks of the army, Genghis began organizing his forces into a decimal system, units of 10, 100, 1,000 and 10,000. Arban, Jagun, Ming, Tumen. Every warrior belonged to one of these units, and each unit had a commander. But crucially, those commanders were not chosen simply because of noble blood or ancient lineage. They were chosen as much as possible for competence and loyalty to Genghis himself. This did several things at once. It broke the automatic link between bloodline and command, which undercut the old aristocracy that had once opposed him. It mixed warriors from different clans into the same fighting units, weakening the tendency to splinter along kinship lines. And it offered a powerful incentive to ambitious men of humble background. Fight well, stay loyal, and you can rise. We see this in the careers of former slaves, captured enemies, and low-status herders who became commanders of thousands because Genghis trusted their ability. At the same time, we start hearing about something later. Sources call the Yasa, often described as a great law code attributed to Genghis Khan. Here the waters get murkier. We don't have a single authoritative text of the Yasa, and later writers may have projected back an image of a comprehensive law code that didn't exist in that neat form. What does seem likely is that around this period, Genghis and his council began formalizing rules that had previously been more fluid custom. Regulations about military discipline, no deserting in battle, no hiding loot, strict requirements to share spoils according to agreed formulas, rules about theft, adultery, the treatment of envoys, the conduct of hunting, even perhaps religious toleration. Whether all of this was ever written down in one place is uncertain, but the effect over time was real, a sense that the Mongol realm was governed by more than just the Khan's mood. There were shared norms, and breaking them had predictable consequences. Another quiet revolution was happening in how conquered peoples were handled. Traditional steppe warfare often meant raid, plunder, enslave, move on. Genghis certainly did not reject brutality. Massacres and terror would be part of his toolkit. But he also saw that people were resources. Craftsmen, scribes, siege engineers, merchants, even rival warriors could be useful if properly integrated. So when tribes surrendered early and sincerely, they were often shown leniency. Chiefs who came over to Genghis before being crushed might retain some status under Mongol overlordship. Their people were redistributed into Mongol units, their sons taken as hostages and raised at the Mongol court or in elite households. Hostages on the steppe were not always prisoners in chains. They were leverage, living guarantees of loyalty, and often ended up deeply embedded in the new order. Plunder too was redistributed more systematically. Instead of a few nobles swallowing the best loot, Genghis made a point of rewarding ordinary warriors in visible ways. That reinforced the idea that it paid to serve him, not just one's own clan. Artisans and specialists captured in war were sometimes exempted from general slaughter and sent to work for the Khan, building the infrastructure of a state that didn't yet fully know it was a state. With the Kurultai behind him, Genghis also began thinking more strategically about the geography of his power. First priority, secure the steppe. Internal enemies had to be neutralized, lingering pockets of resistance folded in or destroyed. The nomadic heartland was both his base of manpower and his supply line of horses, herds, and mobile households. As long as the steppe remained fragmented, any external campaign risked his rear being exposed. So, over the next few years, his attention focused on tying up these loose ends, drawing more tribes into the decimal structure, enforcing discipline, and making sure that the next generation of warriors grew up identifying not just as members of a clan, but as part of a larger Mongol whole under the Great Khan. But Genghis Khan was not building all this just to sit still. The very logic of the new system pushed outward. A growing army needed targets. Ambitious commanders needed campaigns to prove themselves. The steppe, even united, could not offer infinite wealth. Its surplus lay in mobility and manpower, not in cities, mines, or irrigated fields. The real prizes glimmered at the edges, the settled kingdoms around the steppe, with their granaries, trade routes, and walled towns. By 1206, the foundations were in place. A charismatic Khan elevated as something more than a tribal leader, a reorganized army bound by merit and law, a strategy for folding conquered peoples into a growing machine. The next question was obvious. Where would the Mongol storm turn first? It turned first toward the southwest, into a landscape of desert basins, river oases, and walled towns. The Tangut kingdom of Xi Xia. From the Mongol point of view, Xi Xia was close, rich, and tempting. Its lands sat between the Mongol steppe and the great trade arteries that ran towards Central Asia and China. Its rulers controlled caravan routes, irrigation systems, and fortified cities that had been accumulating surplus for centuries. They were also familiar enemies. The Tanguts had once supported some of Chinggis' rivals. They had taken in steppe factions who opposed him, tried to play the old diplomatic game of backing one nomad chief against another, hedging their bets on the instability of the steppe. That game made sense when steppe confederations rose and fell quickly. It was more dangerous when someone like Chinggis refused to fall. So in 1207 and the years that followed, Mongol armies began probing Xi Xia. On paper, this should have been difficult. The Mongols were steppe cavalry, superb at open field battles and raiding, less experienced at taking walls. Xi Xia's strength lay precisely in its fortified cities and irrigation agriculture. But Chinggis was not thinking in terms of paper. He was running a live experiment, testing his newly unified army against a sedentary kingdom and watching what worked. Early campaigns pushed along river valleys, cutting into the countryside, forcing Tangut garrisons to respond. The Mongols did what they did best: feigned retreats, sudden flanking attacks, relentless harassment of any force that tried to leave the safety of walls. Towns that resisted and fell might be plundered heavily. Those that submitted early could be spared, forced into tribute and hostage arrangements. And as they did this, the Mongols were learning. They began recruiting people who knew how to break walls instead of just ride around them. From captured Chinese and Central Asian specialists, they picked up siege techniques, battering rams, mobile shields, catapults capable of hurling stones and fire. These engineers were valuable enough that the Mongols often went out of their way to protect and relocate them. Killing a resisting garrison might send a message. Preserving a handful of siege experts could open the next 10 cities. They also refined a different kind of weapon: fear. Stories began to spread of what happened to cities that resisted too long or killed Mongol envoys. Massacre, enslavement, destruction of irrigation works. The factual details are difficult to untangle, but the psychological effect is clear in later sources. When a Mongol army appeared on the horizon, local elites had to make a calculation: surrender quickly and pay tribute, or gamble on their walls holding against not just cavalry, but an increasingly competent siege train backed by a reputation for ruthless punishment. By 1209, Xi Xia's rulers had learnt that lesson. After a serious campaign that reached deep into their territory and threatened their capital, they agreed to submit. They paid tribute, sent hostages, and acknowledged Genghis as overlord, at least formally. The Mongols did not annex the kingdom outright. They didn't yet have the bureaucratic machinery to run it directly. Instead, they folded Xi Xia into their growing system of dependent states, subordinate, taxed, but left with some internal autonomy. This first success mattered. It brought wealth and prestige. It secured the Mongol western flank and opened routes towards Central Asia. But it also gave Genghis something harder to quantify: proof that his new army could take on a walled agrarian state and win. Once you have that proof, your sense of what is possible changes. North and east of Xi Xia lay a far larger target, the Jurchen Jin dynasty. The Jin ruled much of northern China, including the rich Yellow River Basin and a capital near what is now Beijing, known then as Zhongdu. For decades they had dominated relations with steppe peoples, extracting tribute, playing tribes against each other, sometimes demanding hostages from Mongol chiefs. In earlier years, Temujin himself had fought as a Jin ally against other steppe rivals. Now the positions were reversing. From Chenghiz's perspective, the Jin state was both threat and opportunity. Threat, because as long as a powerful dynasty sat on his southern border, it could meddle in steppe politics, support dissidents, and cut off trade. Opportunity, because its cities, tax systems, and grain stores represented the kind of wealth nomads could not generate on their own. In 1211, the Mongols crossed the frontier. They didn't blunder straight at fortified lines. They manoeuvred. They used scouts to map routes through mountain passes, to locate water sources, to identify weakly defended towns. The Jin's northern defences, built to manage raiders, struggled to respond to a mobile force that could appear in unexpected places, live off seized supplies, and withdraw before a slow imperial army could concentrate. Logistics became a quiet superpower. Mongol armies were designed for movement. Each warrior had multiple horses, allowing them to rotate mounts and travel far without exhausting their animals. Herds of remounts and livestock moved behind the fighting forces, sustaining them in country where conventional armies would have starved. Intelligence networks built on merchants, defectors, and captured officials fed the leadership information about Jin politics and military dispositions. When the Mongols needed more support, they summoned it. Multiple tumens could converge from different directions, using signals and pre-arranged rendezvous points over distances that would have shattered less organized forces. This ability to coordinate widely separated columns made them feel to their enemies like an omnipresent threat. If you left the safety of walls to engage one Mongol force, another might appear on your flank or in your rear. Over the next few years, the Jin state found itself under growing pressure. Some of its frontier commanders fought bravely, others surrendered early, calculating that resistance was futile. As in Xi Xia, the Mongols rewarded early submission and devastated stiff resistance. Towns that opened their gates quickly were often folded into the tribute network, left with local elites in place, but obligated to supply provisions, labour, and increasingly engineers and craftsmen to the Mongol war machine. The internal politics of the Jin did not help. Plague, famine, and factional struggles at court weakened their ability to respond coherently. As the Mongols advanced, Some local leaders decided their best hope of survival lay in cutting separate deals. That fragmentation made coordinated defence even harder. By 1213, Mongol forces were operating deep inside Jin territory. They rode through the passes of the Great Wall, avoiding the strongest fortifications, devastating the countryside, and undermining Jin morale. The once confident dynasty was now debating whether to abandon its northern capital altogether. Zhongdu, the great city near modern Beijing, became the focal point. Surrounded, cut off from much of its hinterland, it endured siege and starvation. Accounts speak of desperate measures inside the walls, including cannibalism, though the exact scale is uncertain. What is clear is that the Mongols did not simply ride in for a quick raid. They stayed, tightening the noose, using the siegecraft they had begun to master in Xi Xia, augmented by Chinese and other engineers, now working under Mongol command. After prolonged resistance, Zhongdu fell in 1215. The city was sacked. Huge numbers of inhabitants were killed or enslaved. Others were spared and resettled according to Mongol needs. Artisans were picked out and sent north. Wealth in the form of silk, grain, metal, and precious goods flowed into Mongol hands. The Jin court, having earlier moved its main seat south to Kaifeng, survived, but it was now a wounded regime, its northern heartland ravaged. For the Mongols, the consequences were enormous. They had confronted a major dynasty, taken its former capital, and forced it onto the defensive. Tribute now flowed from both Xi Xia and significant parts of the Jin realm. Frontier zones that had once been stable under Jin administration became contested spaces ripe for Mongol influence. Local lords and bandit leaders learned that aligning with the Great Khan might be safer than clinging to a declining dynasty. Perhaps most importantly, Mongol confidence hardened into something like certainty. They had seen that disciplined cavalry, coordinated over great distances, supported by hired and captured engineers, and a ruthlessly applied reputation for terror, could crack the walls of sedentary empires. Logistics and intelligence had proven as decisive as arrows and swords. Tribute from conquered and cowed regions now helped finance further campaigns, feeding a feedback loop, conquest funding conquest, victory justifying the next ambition. The storm on the steppe had tested itself against its nearest neighbours and found them vulnerable. With Xi Xia tied into its orbit and the Jin frontier torn open, Genghis Khan could look beyond the familiar horizons of northern China, out toward the great Islamic Empire to the west. A new direction was calling. That western neighbour was the Khwarazmian Empire. On a map, it looked formidable. It stretched from the Aral Sea down toward Persia and Afghanistan, covering the great oases of Transoxiana, places like Bukhara and Samarkand, where merchants from India, Iran, China, and the steppe met to trade silk, spices, paper, and ideas. The Shah of Khwarazm controlled cities, tax systems, fortresses, and caravan routes that had been building wealth for centuries. On paper, this was not a natural first target for steppe horsemen newly triumphant in North China. It was far away, Islamic, culturally sophisticated, plugged into the wider Persianate world. The Mongols had no obvious religious or ideological quarrel with it. Trade, if anything, offered more benefits than war, and that was how it began, with trade. Around 1218, Genghis Khan sent a caravan westward. It was large, valuable, and carefully chosen. Not just merchants, but men who could serve as informal envoys, sounding out the possibilities of a diplomatic relationship. Some sources say they carried letters offering friendship and commercial ties. Others are silent on the exact wording. What they agree on is what happened when that caravan reached the frontier city of Otrar. The governor of Otrar in Alchuk had a choice. He saw a rich caravan from a rising but still distant power. Suspicion, greed, fear of spies, or a desire to impress his own master may all have played a role. He arrested the merchants, accused them of espionage, and had them killed. Their goods were confiscated. When news reached the Mongols, Genghis did not immediately launch an invasion. He sent formal envoys to the Shah, Muhammad II, demanding that the governor be punished and reparations made. The Shah faced his own choice. To hand over a governor of a frontier city to these steppe upstarts would be a humiliation, so he chose the opposite path. He had at least one of the Mongol envoys killed. Others, according to some accounts, were mutilated and sent back. Later chronicles will emphasize outrage here, the sacred status of envoys in steppe and Islamic diplomatic norms, the insult that could only be washed away in blood. Modern historians sometimes add cooler factors. Genghis already watching Transoxiana with interest, already thinking about controlling the Silk Road. The Otrar incident and the murdered envoys may have been spark and pretext all at once. Either way, the decision was made. There would be war. What followed was not a single thrust, but a carefully planned, multi-pronged invasion. Mongol forces moved like water, seeking every gap in the defences. In 1219, the main army crossed the Jaxartes, Syr-Darya, and pushed toward Otrar, the city where it had all begun. Another column swung north and west across the steppe, threatening from unexpected directions. Yet another, under Jochi and Chagatai, moved along different axes, while a picked force under Jabi and Subadei would later arc even farther, probing deep into Iran and the Caucasus. This was strategy on a continental scale. The aim was to prevent the Shah from concentrating his forces. Every direction looked dangerous. Every attempt to relieve one city risked exposing another. Behind the leading elements rode siege specialists gathered from earlier campaigns, engineers capable of building rams, towers, and catapults wherever there was timber and stone. One by one, the great cities of Transoxiana faced a choice much like Zhongdu had. Bukhara, a centre of Islamic learning, fell in early 1220. Accounts describe Genghis entering the city, addressing the inhabitants, perhaps even praying in the main mosque as a way of asserting dominance. How much of this is literal fact and how much later embroidery is debated? What is clear is the message. Your walls and your scholars did not save you. Submission now, or annihilation. Samarkand followed soon after. Its garrison was substantial, bolstered by war elephants and defenders from many parts of the empire. Yet Mongol cavalry cut its supply lines. Engineers brought siege equipment to bear, and defections from within weakened the will to resist. Parts of the defending army reportedly switched sides, calculating that Mongol victory was inevitable. The psychological dimension of Mongol warfare had matured. Stories of earlier massacres, and of mercy granted to those who surrendered quickly, circulated ahead of the armies. Panic could do as much damage as arrows. Some towns opened their gates the moment scouts appeared, others fought desperately and paid dearly. Chroniclers writing decades later speak of entire populations slaughtered, pyramids of skulls, hundreds of thousands killed in a single city. The numbers in these accounts are almost certainly exaggerated. Medieval authors rarely had access to reliable census data, and there were strong incentives to inflate, to glorify Mongol terror, to lament Muslim suffering, to frame the catastrophe in biblical or Quranic terms. Modern estimates tend to be more cautious, suggesting that while mass killings did occur and some regions were devastated, the specific figures in the sources should be treated as rhetorical, not statistical. Still, caution about numbers does not erase the human reality. Cities were burned or partially ruined, irrigation systems damaged, populations displaced or enslaved. Artisans and specialists were separated out and spared, sent east to serve the Mongol state. Others were killed or scattered. The pattern we saw in Xi Xia and Jin intensified. The selective preservation of useful skills amid broad, sometimes horrific destruction. For the Mongols, the Khwarazmian campaign did more than remove an enemy. It punched open the middle of Eurasia. Caravans could now, in principle, move from North China across Mongolia, through Central Asia and into Iran and beyond under a single overarching authority. Intelligence networks followed these routes. So did ideas, technologies and diseases. The Mongol gaze, once fixed on the familiar worlds of the steppe and northern China, now extended confidently toward Persia, the Caucasus, and even the distant lands of the Rus. As ÖGedei and ÖGedei rode westward in pursuit of the fleeing Shah, the map of possibilities in Genghis Khan's mind expanded. The horizon of the empire was no longer just a line along the Great Wall or the Yellow River. It was the whole arc of the continent, curving away into lands the Mongols had barely imagined, but would soon begin to explore with the same relentless experimental energy they had brought to Xi Xia, the Jin, and now the shattered realm of Khwarazm. ÖGedei and Subutai did not march west like a conquering army. They moved more like a question. What lay beyond the ruins of Khwarazm? Who lived there? How did they fight? How quickly could they unite? How far could Mongol forces ride before resistance stiffened or supply lines snapped? These were not academic curiosities. For a steppe empire with no hard western border yet, they were matters of survival. So Genghis Khan gave them a task that sounds almost reckless. Take a relatively small, highly mobile force, keep riding, and find out where the world ended. This was reconnaissance, but not the kind you do from a hilltop with a pair of binoculars. It was reconnaissance in force. You probe by fighting. You draw enemy armies out. You trigger alliances or expose that they don't exist. You learn the map not just in geography, but in political fault lines. First, they hunted the Shah. Muhammad II fled south and west across the Oxus, through Persia toward the Caspian. ÖGedei and Subutai harried, split and probed, breaking his last escorts, scattering what remained of Khwarezmian resistance. By the time he died on an island in the Caspian Sea, his empire already existed more in memory than reality. But the Mongol commanders did not simply turn around and go home. They curved north of the Caspian, then swung down toward the Caucasus, drawn to that mountain knot where Anatolia, Iran and the steppe meet. It was a place of kingdoms rather than empires, of highland fortresses and lowland trade routes. Georgia, Armenia, the Caucasian principalities, Christian polities that had spent generations balancing between Muslim neighbours, steppe raiders and Byzantine or Seljuk influence. When Mongol forces appeared, they weren't understood yet as a world historical threat. More like another wave of nomads, dangerous but perhaps temporary. King George IV of Georgia gathered an army. What followed around 1221 was a series of sharp clashes rather than one neat, storybook battle. Georgian and allied forces tried to block the Mongols in narrow terrain where cavalry would be cramped. ÖGedei and Subutai responded with classic steppe methods, feigned retreats to draw pursuers onto killing grounds, sudden lateral movements to turn flanks, archery storms to wear down heavily armoured knights and infantry. Georgia fought hard. Some accounts emphasize initial Christian successes, then brutal reversals as Mongol tactics took effect. Others compress the whole campaign into a single disaster. Either way, the pattern is consistent with what we've already seen. The Mongols could not occupy every mountain valley, but they could smash every field army sent against them, demand tribute and move on. Armenian lords, local princes, even distant observers took note. Here was a force that negotiated with one hand and tested with the other. They sent envoys offering friendship or vassalage. They asked for guides, hostages, tribute. Refusal did not always bring immediate annihilation. Sometimes it brought a temporary bypass, a mental note for later. Acceptance did not guarantee safety either, but it bought time. Steppe diplomacy operated on a sliding scale of fear, calculation, and future usefulness. From the Caucasus, the expedition turned north again, out onto the Pontic-Caspian steppe, where the grasslands roll toward the lands of the Rus. The Rus principalities were a patchwork: Kiev, Chernigov, Galicia-Volhynia, Vladimir Suzdal, each ruled by princes descended from the Rurikid line, each nursing its own claims, rivalries and grievances. On paper they shared language, religion and dynastic ties. In practice their politics could look like a family feud conducted with armies. The Mongols approached with that in mind. They made contact with steppe groups like the Cumans or Kipchaks, who had long clashed and traded with the Rus. Some Cuman leaders, pushed hard by Mongol pressure, fled to Rus territory and begged for help. Others tried their own negotiations with ÖGedei and Subutai. There are stories of Mongol envoys telling Rus princes in effect, "Don't help the Cumans, stay out of steppe business, and we will not attack you." The Rus rulers did not all hear the same message in those words. Some saw a chance to pose as defenders of Christendom against pagan invaders. Others saw an opportunity to strike at rivals under the cover of coalition war. Some may simply have underestimated these distant nomads, assuming they were just another raiding band. Fragmentation did the rest. In 1223, a coalition army finally formed. Rus contingents from several principalities, Cuman allies various lesser forces. On parchment, it looked impressive. In reality, it was riddled with mistrust. Princes argued about leadership, about routes, about whether to seek battle or wait. Scouts clashed with Mongol screens and came back with confused, contradictory reports. ÖGedei and Subutai had been waiting for exactly this. They lured the coalition deeper east, away from secure bases, stretching its supply lines along the steppe rivers. Then, on the banks of the Kalka River, they set the trap. The details vary in the sources, but the broad outline is clear. The Mongols offered battle, then began a controlled retreat. Some Rus and Cuman contingents pushed after them, sensing a rout. Others held back, wary or simply slower. The coalition unravelled into a long, strung-out column. Discipline frayed. Coordination broke at the chosen moment. Mongol wings wheeled. Fresh units hit pursuers from the flanks and rear. Those who had advanced farthest found themselves isolated and encircled. Steppe archers rode in close, loosed volleys, then peeled away before heavy cavalry could close. Panic spread backward along the line, turning confusion into massacre. By the end, the coalition army was shattered. Some princes were killed on the field, others were captured, then executed in a manner later chroniclers remembered with particular horror, crushed under boards, slowly suffocated while Mongol commanders feasted above, a grim way of spilling noble blood without technically shedding it. The Battle of the Kalka was not just a victory, it was a laboratory. ÖGedei and Subutai had learned how Rus princes formed coalitions, slowly, grudgingly, and with fragile trust. They had measured how far such an army would march, how it would deploy, how its heavy cavalry responded to feigned retreats. They had tested the response time between southern and northern principalities, and how neighbouring steppe peoples might join or fracture under pressure. Then, just when it looked as if the door into Eastern Europe lay wide open, they did something that can feel puzzling from a modern map. They turned back. The Mongols did not march on Kiev or push deeper into the forest zone. Instead, they rode east, back toward the core of the empire, leaving behind stunned survivors, burned steppe camps, and a scattering of stories about strange horsemen from the sunrise. Why? Part of the answer is practical. Their mission had been reconnaissance, not permanent conquest. They had outrun easy lines of support, and Genghis Khan was already engaged elsewhere. Horses needed rest and fresh pastures. The commanders needed to report what they had seen: the strength of Caucasian kingdoms, the fragmentation of the Rus, the usefulness of Cumans as enemies or allies. But many historians also see something more deliberate here. It looks as if they were probing the western edge of the known world, mapping not just roads and rivers but reaction times, alliance patterns, and psychological pressure points. They now knew that Georgian power could be broken, that Armenian and other local rulers were susceptible to steppe-style bargaining, that Rus's unity was more illusion than reality. A decade later, when Mongol armies returned under different leaders, they would come not as a question, but as an answer already half-written by the lessons of JB and Subutai's long ride. For now, though, the horsemen vanished back into the east, leaving the Caucasus and the Rus with a disturbing memory. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a power was measuring them, weighing them, and quietly deciding what to do next. When JB and Subutai finally turned back from the distant west, they were not returning to a peaceful homeland. They were riding into a gathering storm on the eastern horizon. By the mid-1220s, Genghis Khan's empire stretched from northern China to the Caspian, from forests to deserts, from irrigated cities to felt tents on the open steppe. That kind of expansion is exhilarating in stories. In reality, it is exhausting. Frontiers frayed, vassals hedged their bets. Old enemies waited for the moment when the great Khan would be busy somewhere else. One of those enemies was not new at all. Xi Xia, the Tangut kingdom in northwestern China, had already tasted Mongol power years before. They had bowed, sent tribute, provided troops, but as Chinggis turned west toward Khwarazm, Tangut leaders had grown cautious, then evasive, then openly unhelpful. Promised contingents did not appear. Obligations were delayed. It was not full rebellion, more like a sullen refusal to be a reliable partner. For Genghis Khan, whose rule rested on loyalty and fear in equal measure, that was enough. So, after the Western campaigns, the empire's centre of gravity swung back toward China. The aging conqueror prepared one more major war. Xi Xia would be brought to heel a second time, and this time the lesson would be final. The late campaign against Xi Xia has a different feel from his earlier wars. Chroniclers describe a ruler who is still formidable but older, more deliberate, more focused on securing an example than on grabbing new lands. Cities were besieged. Tangut resistance stiffened, then cracked. Envoys came and went with offers, pleas, threats. In the background, another process was unfolding, quieter but just as important, talking about what would happen when Genghis Khan was gone. He had sons by several wives and consorts, but four were especially prominent: Jochi, Chagatai, ÖGedei, and Tului. Each had followers, clients, and ambitions. Each had been given an ulus, an appanage, a share of people and pastures to support their households and future descendants. At first glance, this looked like a reasonable solution. You have a vast empire, you carve it into zones of responsibility. One sun sphere lies toward the far west and the steppe, another's around Central Asia, another's closer to the Mongolian heartland. They owe allegiance to the great Khan, whoever he is, but they also build their own bases of power. Hidden inside this arrangement was a long fuse, because an ulus is not just a pasture. It is a revenue stream. It is a network of loyal commanders. It is a personal brand stamped onto a slice of imperial geography. As generations pass, what begins as your share of father's empire can harden into your independent realm. Genghis Khan seems to have understood that if his line fractured openly while he was alive, the whole experiment could collapse. So succession talks were as much about managing rivalries as about choosing a name. Jochi's legitimacy had already been questioned by Chagatai in earlier years, a dispute that cut to the bone of steppe honour. That tension never fully healed. Jochi died, or at least disappeared from the record before his father, and his sons would later inherit his western claims. Chagatai was powerful, capable and blunt, perhaps too blunt to be a consensus figure. Tolui, the youngest, held the Mongol homelands and core troops, but that very closeness to the centre could make others wary. ÖGedei, by several accounts, was not the strongest warrior or the fiercest personality. He was something subtler, acceptable to more than one faction. A compromise heir. Sources suggest that Genghis Khan, in councils and Kurultai-style gatherings, signalled or formally confirmed ÖGedei as his chosen successor. The logic was not that ÖGedei would rule alone as an autocrat, but that he would sit at the top of a system where brothers and their descendants held their own ulus under a shared imperial framework. For that framework to work, there needed to be habits. In these final years, you can see those habits taking clearer shape. Tribute systems from conquered peoples were regularized instead of improvised. Instead of one-off plunder, there were schedules, assessments, obligations. The Yam relay network, posts with fresh horses, supplies and messengers, began to knit the giant expanse together, allowing orders and news to travel far faster than in most agrarian empires. Local rulers who submitted were often left in place, but now more carefully slotted under Mongol-appointed overseers, with clear chains of responsibility leading back, in theory, to the great Khan's court. Trusted generals and kin were delegated authority to campaign, judge disputes, collect tribute, and move troops without needing constant direct supervision. It was a kind of imperial muscle memory still forming. And then in 1227, during the final Xi Xia campaign, the man around whom all of this revolved died. How exactly remains murky. Later traditions offer competing stories. In some, he fell from his horse during a hunt, injured, and never fully recovered. In others, he succumbed to illness, worn down by years of campaign and age. A more dramatic legend claims he was wounded, or even killed in connection with a Tangut princess, a tale that says more about later imaginations than firm fact. What is striking is not the legend, but the secrecy. His death was concealed, at least for a time, from many of the troops and from the outside world. Orders continued to go out in his name. The Xi Xia campaign was finished with ruthless finality, cities destroyed, the dynasty extinguished. Only when the immediate strategic objectives were secure did the news of his passing fully surface. Secrecy here was not just personal pride, it was statecraft. If word spread too soon that the great Khan was dead, enemies might rally, vassals might waver, internal factions might move faster than the arrangements he had tried to put in place. By veiling his death until the Xi Xia problem was solved, and the empire could pivot to a great Kurultai, the Mongol leadership tried to buy time for unity. When the body was finally taken back toward Mongolia, it was wrapped in layers of myth. Chroniclers speak of a secret burial place, of escorts killing anyone who saw the procession, of a tomb hidden in an unmarked spot on a mountain. Archaeology has never confirmed a single certain grave. The very absence is part of the story. A ruler who had redrawn the map of Eurasia vanished back into the steppe soil, leaving behind no monumental pyramid, no inscribed stone, only rumours and a lineage. What he did leave very deliberately was a structure, sons with defined ulus, a chosen successor, a habit of convening great assemblies to confirm the Khan, and a growing administrative skeleton, relay stations, tribute systems, delegated governors that could, in theory, survive the founder. In practice, the seeds of future fragmentation were already planted. Each branch of the family had its own grazing lands, its own revenue, its own soldiers. They were tied together by oaths, habit, and the memory of Genghis Khan. As long as those bonds held, the empire could act as one. The task of ÖGedei, and of the next decade, would be to see whether that fragile unity could last without the man who had first forged it on the steppe. The first years after Genghis Khan's death were a kind of held breath. Tolui acted as regent, managing the core troops and the homelands, while a great Kurultai could be organised. No one wanted to move too quickly, move too slowly, and the whole lattice of fear and loyalty might start to unravel. Move too quickly, and resentments might harden into open breaks. When the Kurultai finally met, probably near the Orkhon River, the choice that had been prepared in the founder's lifetime was brought forward: ÖGedei. He was not the eldest, not the most feared commander, not the one with the tightest grip on the Mongol heartland. He was instead the one around whom a consensus could form. Chagatai, who had once quarrelled so fiercely with Jochi, is said to have publicly supported ÖGedei's claim. Tolui, with his own formidable following, stepped back. Whether these gestures were purely loyal or edged with calculation, they mattered. The Kurultai affirmed ÖGedei as Great Khan, but that did not erase the Ulus. It wrapped a single cloak of authority over a body that already had multiple limbs. ÖGedei's problem was not creating an empire. It was teaching it how to function without constant improvisation. Under his rule, the ad hoc tribute arrangements of the conquest years began to harden into something more like administration. In the lands taken from the Jin and in Central Asia, officials were tasked with counting, listing, classifying. Censuses were ordered: who lived where, how many households, what they produced. On the steppe, you could measure wealth by herds and followers. In cities, by grain and coin. To tax a city, you needed numbers. Mongol rulers did not personally draw up tables, but they learned to employ people who could. Muslim administrators from Khwarazmian and Persian backgrounds, Chinese clerks and scribes, Uyghur literati trained in earlier bureaucratic traditions. All were recruited, sometimes coerced, into service. They offered models for land tax, poll tax, trade duties. The empire became a patchwork of fiscal systems, but now with an eye toward regular revenue instead of one-time loot. Alongside this grew the yam, the relay system that earlier campaigns had only sketched out. Imagine a line of stations spreading across the grasslands and deserts, each with fresh horses, fodder and supplies, each overseen by officials who kept track of who passed through and at what cost. Couriers carrying a paisa, a tablet of authority, could gallop from one post to the next, change horses, eat, sleep a little, and be back on the road before dawn. Messages that might have taken weeks under older regimes could now cross the empire in a fraction of the time. Orders, intelligence reports, pleas for help, lists of tribute, all rode this arterial network. It was the empire's nervous system, and ÖGedei strengthened it relentlessly, granting exemptions and privileges to those who maintained it, punishing those who interfered. In the Orkhon Valley, the centre of this growing machine took on a more concrete form. ÖGedei chose Karakoram as his capital, turning what had been a seasonal encampment zone into a semi-permanent seat. It was not a city in the Chinese or Persian sense, with stone walls and ancient shrines, but it became a node where many worlds met. Artisans were brought in from conquered territories, metal workers from Central Asia, carpenters and stonemasons from China, jewelers, scribes, translators. Markets sprang up. Caravans arrived with silk, furs, spices, glassware. Envoys from distant courts trudged in, dusty and tired, to bow before a Khan who still preferred the comfort of a jur to any palace room he had built. Religious specialists came too. Nestorian Christian clergy from the Turkic steppe, Buddhist monks from North China and Tibet, Muslim scholars from Bukhara and Samarkand, shamans from Mongol and forest tribes. ÖGedei, like his father, did not try to impose a single faith. Instead, he granted privileges to multiple traditions, accepting prayers and blessings from all, so long as their bearers did not threaten his authority or his revenue. Karakorum in these years symbolized something new, a steppe court that could summon the skills of sedentary civilizations without becoming one of them, a hub that plugged pastoral power into the circuits of Eurasian trade. But all of this ordering and building was not an end in itself. It was preparation. ÖGedei understood, or was convinced by his generals, that an empire that stopped expanding too soon could easily turn inward and tear itself apart. The new census figures, tax arrangements, and relay lines were not just about stability. They were about capacity. With reliable revenue, you could provision large armies far from home. With census rolls, you could draft or demand contingents more systematically from conquered peoples. With a yam, you could coordinate multi-front campaigns across thousands of kilometers, adjusting plans as news arrived. In councils at Karakorum, strategies were laid for what would come next: the final crushing of the Jin in northern China, deeper pushes into Korea, and in the west, an even more ambitious thrust into the lands of the Rus, Poland and Hungary. The great Khan who had been chosen as a compromise figure was, in practice, turning his inheritance into an engine. Under ÖGedei, the Mongol Empire took the raw, explosive power of Genghis Khan's conquests and began to channel it, systematize it, prepare it for a second wave. North China, in the early 1230s, was a wounded landscape that still hadn't bled out. The Jin dynasty, battered by Genghis Khan's campaigns and hemmed in by the rising Song to the south, was reduced to a crescent of territory along the Yellow River and the Huai. Its great capital at Zhongdu, future Beijing, had already fallen. Officials had fled south to Kaifeng. Refugee streams, ruined fields, shattered garrisons. This was not the confident empire that had once dominated the steppe frontier. ÖGedei and his advisors saw something very simple. As long as Jin existed, even in this truncated form, it was a shield for the southern Song, a buffer state absorbing Mongol pressure, blocking direct contact and complicating any future move into the Yangtze basin. Remove the shield and the Song world would lie exposed. So the order went out for renewed campaigns, not as tentative probes but as a closing fist. By now, Mongol armies in North China looked very different from the all-cavalry forces of the early years. The core was still steppe horsemen, but around them clustered contingents of subject peoples. Khitan and Jurchen troops from former Jin domains, Chinese infantry and crossbowmen, Turkic auxiliaries, siege specialists from Transoxiana, and increasingly engineers. Genghis Khan had already experimented with hiring or coercing siege experts from conquered polities. Under ÖGedei, this became standard practice. Muslim engineers from Khwarazmian and Persian cities brought experience with counter-fortifications, mines, and heavy artillery. Chinese artisans contributed advanced knowledge of traction trebuchets, city walls, and defensive layouts. Put together, they formed an improvised but formidable corps of specialists. They designed siege trains that could be broken down, hauled across mountain passes or frozen rivers, and reassembled outside targeted cities. They oversaw the construction of earthen ramps, sapping tunnels, and artillery platforms. Walls that earlier nomad armies would simply have ridden around could now be treated as solvable problems. The Jin court understood the danger. They tried to play the remaining pieces on the board, appealing to the Song for support, shifting capitals, fortifying river lines. For a brief moment, Song and Jin even found themselves in a kind of uneasy parallel struggle against the same encroaching power, each hoping the other would absorb the worst of the blow. But the Mongols were learning to exploit these fractures. Song officials had little love for Jin, whose rule they had long regarded as an illegitimate occupation of lost northern lands. Agreements were made, talks held, limited coordination attempted. Yet beneath the formal language lay a shared suspicion. The Mongols suspected the Song would strike at Jin positions only when it suited them. The Song suspected that once Jin fell, the horsemen would not simply stop at the agreed frontier. They were both right. Between 1230 and 1234, Mongol campaigns pressed south and east in coordinated arcs. Columns crossed the frozen Yellow River in winter, bypassing strongpoints that were left to secondary forces and siege units. Cities fell one by one, some after bargaining, others after brutal storms. In 1233-1234, the noose closed around the last Jin stronghold at Kaizhou. Jin defenders fought, negotiated, delayed. Mongol commanders alternated threats with offers of surrender terms. Song forces hovered nearby, hoping to reclaim territory when the dust settled, but also wary of being drawn into a direct clash. In early 1234, the Jin emperor, facing starvation and no hope of rescue, is said to have taken his own life, rather than be captured. With that act, the Jin dynasty, which had ruled northern China since the 12th century, ceased to exist. Why did this matter so much? Strategically, the entire northern Chinese plain, from the Great Wall down to the Huai, now had no indigenous dynasty to claim it. Every tax-paying household, every irrigated field, every city wall became, in principle, available for Mongol use. The Song no longer had a northern rival to balance against the steppe. Administratively, it forced a transformation. North China could not be managed like a conquered pasture with a few tribute posts. It contained some of the densest populations and most productive farmland on earth. To squeeze steady revenue out of it, the Mongols leaned even more heavily on Chinese and Khitan bureaucrats, many of whom had already worked under Jin. Registers were updated or entirely redrawn, households were listed, fields surveyed, storehouses counted. Some regions were parcelled out as appanages to princes and commanders, who then had to work with Chinese clerks to turn those holdings into grain, cloth, coin, and cartloads of supplies. For civilians, this transition could feel like both continuity and rupture at once. On the one hand, offices still functioned, seals still stamped documents, familiar language still filled administrative forms. On the other hand, above these surviving structures loomed new masters who did not share local assumptions. Tax rates could be renegotiated or simply imposed. Corvée labour for canal repair or city wall maintenance now alternated with demands to haul fodder to Mongol garrisons or provide carts for distant campaigns. In some areas, devastation left by earlier fighting meant fields lay fallow and villages empty. The Mongol authorities, interested in revenue rather than desert, sometimes encouraged resettlement, moving people from more secure zones to repopulate strategic regions. In other cases, surviving communities shouldered heavy burdens to make up for lost neighbours. Yet, over a few years, something weighty settled into place. North China became not just conquered territory, but a base. From its cities, artisans and engineers could be drafted for future wars. From its granaries, grain could be requisitioned to feed horses and men campaigning far away. Its river routes and roads could be folded into the yam system, turning a formerly contested frontier into a logistical heartland. The complex dance with the Southern Song continued, now along a much longer shared boundary. Raids, truces, negotiations, limited alliances against local bandits, all layered over a deeper awareness on both sides. The Jin buffer was gone. Between the Steppe Empire and the rich lands of the Yangtze, there was now only a line on a map, and a growing sense that sooner or later one side would test how firm it really was. While North China was being turned into a base, a different kind of calculation was forming far to the west. If the empire was to be more than a chain of conquests, it needed secure flanks. The Khwarazmian heartland had been smashed, but beyond it lay a loose mosaic of forest principalities, steppe tribes and distant kingdoms who did not yet understand what had risen on the Eurasian grasslands. ÖGedei and his commanders saw a problem and an opportunity wrapped together. The problem, the Volga steppe and the forest beyond, could shelter enemies, rebellious tribes, or exiles from shattered states. The opportunity, those same regions controlled trade routes that funneled furs, slaves and silver into the Islamic world and, indirectly, into Europe. So they launched what later chroniclers would remember as the Great Western Invasion. Overall command on the ground rested with Batu, a grandson of Genghis, nominally the leader of the campaign. But behind him, like a quiet gravitational field, was Subutai, the strategist who had already helped design victories from North China to the Caucasus. Their objectives were layered. First, subdue the Volga Bulgars and the Kipchak steppe, securing the grasslands. Then, move into the Rus principalities, shattering potential coalitions and forcing tribute. Finally, probe deeper into Europe, testing Poland and Hungary, gauging strength, breaking networks that might one day threaten the empire's western frontier. The sequencing was careful, not random. In 1236, the Volga Bulgars were targeted. Their towns fell, their trading posts were burned or harnessed to Mongol supply needs. With the Volga line broken, Mongol forces could move more freely between Central Asia and the Western steppe. Then came the Rus. Here it wasn't a single enemy, but a cluster of rival principalities. Vladimir Suzdal, Ryazan, Chernigov, Kiev and others bound by language and faith, but divided by politics. Subutai's answer was to hit them piecemeal in winter, when frozen rivers became highways. Ryazan was taken and destroyed. Vladimir's great stone churches watched fires spread through the city. Some princes died fighting, others fled, some were captured. Chronicles from the Rus' side linger on bells torn down, icons looted, populations killed or driven off. Mongol sources, fewer in number here, emphasize the establishment of order and submission. In the end, the pattern that mattered was not individual sackings, but what followed. The surviving Rus princes, one by one, learned a new ritual. They travelled to the Mongol camp, later to the Khan's court on the Volga, to receive a patent of authority in return for tribute. Silver, furs, slaves and military support were expected. Local rule could continue, but only under the shadow of a distant Khan. It was a tributary relationship with teeth. With the forest zone cowed, Batu and Subutai pushed further west in 1240 to 1241. Kiev, once a major political and spiritual centre, was stormed and badly damaged. Then the armies split. One wing moved toward Poland, another angled toward Hungary and the Carpathian Basin. Here, our sources turn noisy and contradictory. European chronicles describe panic, omens, atrocities. Mongol units vanished into fog and forests, reappeared where least expected. At Legnica in Silesia, a combined force of Polish knights, German contingents, and military orders faced a Mongol detachment. What exactly happened is hard to reconstruct cleanly. Some accounts speak of feigned retreats and encirclements, standard Mongol methods. Others mention the use of smoke or incendiary devices that disoriented the defenders. Most agree on the core point. The European army broke, its leader, Duke Henry the Pious, was killed, and the road into Central Europe lay open. But Legnica was, in Mongol terms, a flank action. The main weight of the invasion fell on Hungary, where King Bela IV had accepted large numbers of Cumans fleeing Mongol pressure on the steppe, to Batu and Subutai. This looked like a potential hostile coalition forming on their border. At Mohi, on the Saho River, the Hungarian Royal Army and its allies assembled behind wagons and river defences. Here, too, accounts clash in the details. Some chronicles stress the courage of the defenders, others the confusion and breakdown. What seems consistent across sources is the broad outline. Subutai directed a coordinated attack, with one force tying down the camp while another crossed the river at a different point, hitting from the rear. Night attacks, engineering work on the bridge, and classic steppe manoeuvre tactics combined to collapse the Hungarian position. The camp was overrun. Casualties were enormous. After Mohi, there was little organised resistance left in the kingdom. Towns and villages were sacked. Plains were ridden over. Refugees clogged roads heading west. So why didn't the Mongols stay? Here we move from narrative into interpretation. One factor was political in late 1241. ÖGedei Khan died back in Mongolia. According to later traditions, this triggered a recall. Princes needed to return east for a great Kurultai to decide the next supreme ruler. How binding this obligation felt in the moment is debated, but it clearly mattered to men like Batu, whose own status depended on decisions made in the steppe heartland. Another factor was strategic. Central Europe was not like the Volga grasslands. The terrain was more broken, the climate less familiar, the supply lines longer. The immediate objectives, punishing potential enemies, demonstrating power, breaking up steppe coalitions sheltering under European crowns, had been achieved. Permanent occupation would have required a different kind of administrative investment in a region that did not yet sit at the centre of Mongol concerns. Turning back did not mean giving up. In the 1240s and 1250s, the western part of the Mongol Empire coalesced into what later historians call the Golden Horde, centred on the Volga. Batu's Ulus became a steppe kingdom that looked both east to the rest of the empire and west toward Rus and beyond. From their new capitals along the Volga, Mongol and Turkic elites oversaw tributary arrangements with the Rus princes. These arrangements reshaped Eastern Europe. Kiev's earlier preeminence faded. More northerly centres like Moscow began to grow in importance in part because of how they navigated relations with the horde. Some princes became key intermediaries, collecting tribute from their rivals and passing it on, gaining leverage at home. Trade routes shifted as well. The Volga corridor and the Black Sea steppe were drawn more tightly into Eurasian networks, moving slaves, wax, furs, cloth, and coins between the Baltic, the Islamic world, and, indirectly, the Mediterranean. Under the long shadow of the horde, Rus principalities learned to balance local ambitions with the demands of a distant Khan. Violence remained a constant possibility, but so did negotiation, alliance, and gradual adaptation. Central Europe, meanwhile, had received a brutal warning and a puzzle. Knights and kings had seen an army unlike those they were used to fighting. Mobile, coordinated, apparently willing to vanish as suddenly as it had arrived. The storm had rolled in from the east, devastated vast regions, and then, just as its thunder echoed loudest, turned away. But the empire that had sent it was not done. While the Golden Horde took shape in the west, and Rus adjusted to tributary rule, Mongol eyes were already turning back toward the south, and to the still unconquered wealth of the Song. Back in the heartland, the story had taken a quieter but more dangerous turn. ÖGedei Khan, the man who had turned Chinggis's conquests into a functioning imperial machine, was not old by modern standards. But he was tired, heavy, and according to several sources, very fond of drink. In late 1241, while the Western armies were pushing into Europe, he died. The timing felt like someone had pulled a handbrake on history. The empire did not shatter, armies did not mutiny, tax caravans did not instantly stop. From China to Iran to the Volga, grain still moved, herds still grazed, scribes still copied orders. But the momentum of expansion, that sense of an empire always rolling outward, faltered. Because now the question was, who next? On paper, the answer should have been simple. ÖGedei had sons. He had already designated one of them, Guyuk, as heir. But Mongol succession was never purely hereditary. It ran through the Kurultai, the great council of princes and nobles, where a new Khan had to be acclaimed. And before that could happen, someone had to hold the centre. That someone was Turegene Khatun, ÖGedei's chief wife. By custom, a principal widow could act as regent until a new Khan was chosen. Turegene stepped into that role with remarkable energy. She moved allies into key positions, courted support from influential nobles, and opened her court to new patrons, including scholars, merchants, and administrators from the Islamic world who saw an opportunity in the shifting winds. Her regency was not a gentle caretaker government. It was a battlefield. Different branches of the imperial family watched her closely. The ÖGedeids, her own line, wanted to secure Guyuk's eventual election and keep the throne in their hands. The Jochids, Batu's line in the west, had their own interests, shaped by new power on the Volga. The Shagataids in Central Asia, guardians of an older steppe aristocracy, guarded their autonomy. And in the background, quieter but very much present, stood the Toluid branch, descended from Chinggis's youngest son. Tolui, men like Monka and Kublai, who were not yet dominant but were already building their own networks. All of them understood the same thing. The longer a regency lasted, the more the balance of power could shift. So why not simply hold a Kurultai and settle it? Because a Kurultai was not just a meeting. It was an event that had to feel legitimate to all major lines of the family. Princes scattered from North China to the Caucasus had to be summoned. Armies needed time to stand down or hand command to trusted deputies. Supply lines for tens of thousands of riders, attendants, and camp followers had to be organized. Even in the best conditions, this took months. In an empire stretched across half the known world, it could take years. Meanwhile, everyone was maneuvering. Turegene used the delay. She dismissed some of ÖGedei's older ministers, replacing them with her own clients. She encouraged petitioners who criticized her late husband's heavy drinking and harsh policies, subtly shifting the narrative about his reign. She cultivated religious figures, especially from Muslim communities, who could lend moral authority to her rule. Her opponents did not sit still either. Batu, far to the west, was in no rush to see Guyuk enthroned, given their personal hostility. Other lines worried that a strong ÖGedei centre might clip their autonomy. Some simply resented the influence of a powerful woman at the top of the political pyramid, even though steppe traditions allowed for such roles. Yet for most people inside the empire, daily life was not defined by these intrigues. In North China, the tax system ÖGedei and his advisors had built kept functioning. Local administrators, many of them Chinese, Khitan, or Central Asian, continue to collect grain, cloth, and labour service, forwarding revenues to regional headquarters. In Iran and Transoxiana, caravan routes stayed open, watched over by Mongol garrisons and local notables who had already learned how to profit from imperial peace. In the Rus lands, princes still rode to the Volga to offer tribute to Batu's court, even as the question of the Supreme Khan remained unsettled. This was one of the empire's paradoxes. At the very top, power was in limbo. A regent was building factions. Princes were calculating. A future Kurultai loomed like a storm that refused to break. Yet beneath that suspended sky, a web of scribes, merchants, tax farmers, local rulers, and military governors kept the machine humming. The conquests slowed, but the empire did not sleep. It was waiting when the Kurultai finally met, and a new Khan was raised on the veldt. The choices made during Teregani's regency, the alliances, the resentments, the quiet accumulation of favours owed, would shape what came next. The storm finally broke in 1246. After years of delay, summons went out across the steppes and beyond. Princes from the Jochid lands on the Volga, from Chagatais' domain in Central Asia, from the Toloid camps in Mongolia and North China, all were called to gather. The empire needed a new centre, a single name that could be stamped at the bottom of every order. The Kurultai met on Mongol soil near Karakorum. There, under the weight of tradition, Teregani's long project came to fruition. Her son, Guyuk, was acclaimed Great Khan. On the surface it looked like continuity. Chinggis, ÖGedei, now ÖGedei's son. The line of succession seemed to pass smoothly from father to son, as if an imperial dynasty was crystallizing. Underneath, things were not smooth at all. Guyuk had not forgotten the years of regency, the men his mother had promoted, the rivals who had worked against his elevation, the insults, real or imagined, that had accumulated while he was waiting in the wings. He was not a passive figure cut out for ceremonial rule. Contemporary sources portray him as proud, sharp-tempered, and conscious of his dignity. And he was stepping into a world where other men thought of themselves as kings in all but name. Batu in the west had just overrun Rus, Poland, and Hungary. He commanded vast pastures, huge herds, and a growing network of tribute-paying princes. He was no longer just a grandson of Chinggis. He was the lord of a region that felt like its own universe. In Central Asia, the Chagataid princes guarded their belt of territory from the Ili Valley down to the Caucasus. They had their own noble factions, their own legal traditions, their own sense of being guardians of an older, purer steppe order. The Toloid branch, meanwhile, was quietly gathering strength. Mumka and his brothers had distinguished themselves on campaign. They were close to powerful generals, and increasingly to the administrators who made the empire's revenue flow. Guyuk was Great Khan, but he was not the unquestioned master of all these worlds. He was more like a spider dropped into the centre of a web that others had already begun weaving. One way to project that authority beyond the steppe was through letters and embassies. Under Guyuk, formal contact with the Latin West intensified. Mongol envoys had already reached Europe during the Great Western Invasion, but those missions were mostly about reconnaissance and intimidation. Now the correspondence took on a more diplomatic flavour, at least from one side. Envoys from the papacy and various European rulers approached the Mongols with ideas shaped by their own mental universe. Some spoke of potential alliances against Muslim powers, imagining a Christendom and Mongols coalition aimed at the Islamic world. Others hoped for the conversion of the Khan, or at least for guarantees of safety for Christian communities in the east. When these men arrived at the Mongol court, they found something very different from what they expected. From the Mongol perspective, there were no equal alliances. There was only submission and obedience to the Great Khan, or resistance to be crushed. Letters sent back to Europe in Guyuk's name reflected this. They did not read like polite diplomatic exchanges. They read like commands from a universal sovereign, inviting or ordering distant kings and popes to acknowledge his supremacy and come in person to serve. This was not arrogance in the abstract. It was how the institution of the Great Khan had been imagined since Chinggis's time, as a world-claiming office backed by heaven's mandate. The result, though, was a set of profound misunderstandings. Europeans saw the Khan's letters as insulting, even blasphemous. The Mongols likely saw European replies as evasive and presumptuous, while parchment travelled between Karakoram and the West. A far more dangerous exchange was unfolding inside the imperial family. The old hostility between Guyuk and Batu did not disappear with Guyuk's enthronement. If anything, it sharpened. Each man represented more than himself. Behind Batu stood the Jochid princes, the wealth of the Volga, and a mass of hardened Tumans. Behind Guyuk stood the prestige of the central court, the ÖGedei line, and those who wanted a strong directive centre. Arguments about precedence and protocol concealed deeper questions. Who had the right to summon whom? Was Batu obligated to appear personally at the great Khan's court when called, or could he rule his western domain with near total autonomy? How far did the Khan's word actually reach when the man it was aimed at commanded his own armies and his own sources of revenue? Tension escalated. According to some accounts, Guyuk contemplated a major move west, ostensibly to inspect the frontiers, but very possibly to confront Batu and break his power. Batu, no fool, was wary. The steppe was wide, but not wide enough for two men of that stature to feel comfortable with each other's existence. Then, suddenly, the decision point vanished. In 1248, while still relatively young, Guyuk died on campaign, far from the polished felt and ritual of Karakoram. The circumstances are murky. Some traditions blame illness, perhaps brought on by alcohol and the rigours of travel. Others whisper about poison, about plots that did not want to see a direct clash between Guyuk and Batu, or did not want the ÖGedei line to solidify its grip. We simply don't know for certain. What is clear is that once again the empire's centre dissolved into a vacuum. Guyuk had ruled for only a short time. His reign had not been long enough to heal factional rifts, to establish a stable pattern of succession, or to embed his house so deeply that others could not challenge it. Instead, his brief time as Great Khan left behind sharper resentments, half-finished confrontations, and a renewed sense that the title itself was up for grabs. Every short reign, every sudden death, added another layer of instability. The ritual of the Kurultai was supposed to bind the empire together under a single will. But by the late 1240s, each new Kurultai also meant another round of bargaining, another chance for rival branches to test their strength, another gamble that everyone would show up and accept the outcome. In the quiet camps along the Orkhon, in the crowded markets of North China, in the tributary courts on the Volga, people felt the pattern forming. The empire was still immense, its roads still carried goods, its armies still commanded fear, but the centre, the single point from which everything was meant to radiate, kept flickering. Out of that uncertainty, a different kind of answer was beginning to form, one that would not come from the ÖGedei line at all. The answer, when it came, wore a Toluid face. After Guyuk's death, the empire drifted in a kind of controlled uncertainty. Regents and senior princesses tried to manage affairs, but everyone knew this was a holding pattern. The real issue was simple and dangerous. Whose branch of the family would claim the centre next? Batu, powerful in the west and no friend of the ÖGedei's, began to move the pieces. He had no desire to see another ÖGedei on the throne, and he understood that a Khan chosen without his backing would always be vulnerable. So he used what he had: prestige from the western conquests, control over vital pastures and trade routes, and the quiet support of those who were tired of ÖGedei dominance. The man he pushed forward was Mongol, eldest son of Tolui, grandson of Chinggis, already respected as a serious commander. Mongol had campaigned in North China and the Middle East. He was known to be sober, personally frugal, more interested in order than spectacle. Kurultais were called, one near Batu's power base, another in Mongol heartland. Different sources describe different gatherings, different procedures, different levels of consensus. Some emphasize broad acclaim, others hint at pressure, selective invitations, and the exclusion of hostile princes. Chroniclers close to the victorious side tend to present the process as smooth and legitimate. Others, writing for dispossessed factions, remember it as coerced. What seems likely is that Munka's elevation in 1251 was not a gentle family meeting. It was a political act backed by force. Once accepted as Great Khan, Munka moved quickly to make sure that acceptance would stick. Investigations were launched into the conduct of prominent ÖGedeids and their allies. Accusations of corruption, embezzlement, and disloyalty became tools in a larger purge. Some princes were executed. Others were stripped of their positions or saw their appanages reduced. Men who had seemed untouchable under previous regimes found themselves on the wrong side of inquiries. Later narratives exaggerate in different directions. Some Muslim and Chinese sources underline the cruelty. Others, especially those written under Ptolemid friendly patrons, stress the necessity of cleaning out a corrupt old order. The truth is probably somewhere between. Monk was genuinely concerned with restoring discipline, and also fully aware that a great Khan who tolerated strong rival centres of power would not stay great for long. With the political ground cleared, he turned to the machinery of empire itself. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol realm was vast but uneven. Some regions were carefully taxed, others were squeezed arbitrarily by local commanders and tax farmers. Merchants could prosper under high-level protection one year and be plundered by lesser officials the next. To Monkey, this was not just unjust, it was inefficient. He ordered comprehensive censuses across the core domains, in North China, Iran, Central Asia, and parts of the steppe. These were not small undertakings. Enumerators counted households, livestock, land, crafts. They tried to distinguish between soldiers, civilians, religious communities, and merchants. The goal was to know as precisely as possible who owed what. From that information came reforms. Taxation, which had often been piled on ad hoc, was to be regularized. Instead of multiple overlapping levies, there would be set obligations calibrated to local conditions. In theory, burdens were to be predictable, even if not light. In practice, this meant some elites lost the ability to extract whatever they could, whenever they could. Munka also went after corruption. Envoys were dispatched to audit officials. Some notorious tax farmers and administrators were punished harshly, not just for theft, but for extortion and arbitrary violence. The message was clear. The empire's revenues belonged to the Khan and heaven, not to individual opportunists. At the same time, Monkey needed to keep the conquest engine running. Rather than leading every major campaign himself, he embraced a strategic division of labour within his own branch. His brother Hulagu was assigned to the southwest, with orders to deal with the Ismaili fortresses in Iran, and beyond them, the Abbasid Caliphate and remaining powers in Iraq and Syria. Another brother, Kublai, was tasked with intensifying the pressure on the Song dynasty in southern China. It was a calculated move. By delegating entire theatres to trusted siblings, Munka could extend Mongol reach without diluting the idea of a single centre. Victories in Persia and China would be won under Ptolemid banners, but they would also, in theory, reinforce the authority of the Great Khan at Karakoram. While these grand offensives were being prepared, Monkey tightened control over the empire's heartlands. In Central Asia and North China, he tried to stabilize land assignments, preventing constant reshuffling of territories between princes. In the steppe homeland, he reaffirmed key laws attributed to Genghis re-emphasizing military discipline, the duties of commanders, and the rights of commoners to some basic protection from arbitrary seizure. Near the Volga and in the Chagatai regions, his touch had to be lighter. Batu and his house still wielded immense power, and the Chagataids cherished their own legal traditions. But even there, envoys from Munka's court reminded local rulers that their rule was derivative, their seals valid only because a higher seal existed. For ordinary subjects in many regions, Munk's reign could feel paradoxical. On one hand, there was a push for more knowledge, more order, more consistent extraction. On the other, there were attempts to limit the worst abuses and to make imperial demands more predictable. For a merchant travelling from Bukhara to North China, this might translate into safer roads, more standardized tolls, fewer surprises. For a noble who had grown rich on informal gifts, it meant losing income and influence. And that was the cost. Resentment simmered among sections of the old ÖGedei and Chagataid elites who saw their status eroded by Tolui ascendancy. Even among the Jochids whose chief Batu had helped make Ming Khan, there were mutters about the long-term implications of a Toluid-centred empire. Every census that counted men and horses for service, every tax clarified on paper, was also a reminder that local autonomy had limits. The dynastic rifts that had opened after Chingiz's death did not close under Munkay. In some ways they deepened. The Toluid house was now clearly first among equals, and its younger princes were being planted as rulers in the richest, most strategic regions of the world. For the moment, though, the system seemed to work. The centre was stronger than it had been in years. Revenue flowed more steadily. Armies were being assembled on the Chinese frontier and in the Iranian highlands. The empire felt, once again, like a storm gathering strength. What that storm would do when Munka's brothers finally unleashed it on Baghdad, and the song would redraw maps and memories from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. Hulagu rode west as the cutting edge of this new organised empire. His mandate from Munka was broad but not vague. Break the powers that could threaten Mongol communication and revenue in the southwest. End the independent warlords in the Iranian mountains. Bring the Abbasid Caliph either fully into the imperial system or remove him. Reach as far into Syria as circumstances allowed. In return, he would have immense resources, pick troops from across the steppe, Chinese and Persian siege engineers, and the political backing of the great Khan. The first target was not Baghdad, it was stone. For decades, one of the most stubborn obstacles to Mongol expansion in Iran had been the Nizari Ismailis, the community often labelled by outsiders as the assassins. Their real power did not lie in isolated daggers, but in a network of mountain fortresses strung across difficult terrain, especially in the Alborz range and northern Iran. From these strongholds they taxed caravans, forged alliances, and occasionally eliminated hostile rulers. They also, importantly, occupied passes that any army moving between Central Asia and Mesopotamia needed to secure. Munka's instructions were clear: no more half measures. Fortresses would submit or be dismantled. Hulagu advanced methodically. He sent envoys offering terms: surrender, dismantle walls, accept Mongol oversight, and live, resist and face annihilation. Some castles yielded, calculating that compromise was better than hopeless defence. Others hesitated, trusting in their cliffs and past miracles. The most famous, Alamut, had a reputation in Islamic and European writing as almost untouchable, a place of libraries, gardens and steep paths that could be held by a handful of men. In 1256, Hulagu surrounded it with siege engines, sappers and patience. After a comparatively short campaign, the fortress capitulated. Later sources disagree on the details. How much was destroyed? How many books were burned? how far Mongol troops went in looting and killing, but the political meaning was unmistakable. The age of independent strongholds, bargaining from behind high walls, was ending in Iran. You could have your castle, or you could have your autonomy, but not both. With the Nizari network broken or cowed, the road to Iraq lay open. Baghdad in 1258 was no longer the glittering metropolis of the early Abbasid age, but it was still a major city, a symbol as much as a place. The Abbasid Caliph claimed spiritual authority over much of the Sunni Muslim world. His court, though weaker than in its golden centuries, still mattered to scholars, jurists, and rulers who valued the prestige his name could confer. Mönche and Hülegu did not approach Baghdad as a minor raid. Envoys went ahead, demanding fuller submission, tribute, and cooperation than the Abbasids had previously offered. The Caliph al-Mustasim and his advisers misread the moment. Whether out of overconfidence, bad counsel, or simple hesitation, they failed to mobilize allies effectively or to satisfy Mongol demands. Hülegu's forces crossed the Tigris, encircled the city, and began a siege with a level of engineering that stunned contemporaries. Walls that had withstood earlier troubles could not withstand counterweight trebuchets, sapping, and the shock of a disciplined multi-ethnic army coordinated by Mongol command structures. When Baghdad fell in February 1258, the aftermath entered memory as trauma. Muslim chroniclers, writing from within an Islamic civilizational frame, often describe an almost unimaginable slaughter, libraries emptied into the river, mosques desecrated, and the Caliph himself killed in a way that later storytellers embellished into grim legend. Christian writers closer to Mongol patrons sometimes emphasize the sparing of certain quarters, the role of Nestorian and other communities in mediating, and present Hülegu as an instrument of divine punishment on a corrupt or complacent regime. Modern historians, trying to sift numbers from rhetoric, tend to see clear exaggeration in the claimed death tolls, but they rarely doubt that destruction was massive. What unites most traditions is the sense that an old order had been ruptured. The line of Abbasid caliphs that had begun in the 8th century ended in Mongol hands. An iconic capital lay broken. From this shock, a new structure emerged, the Ilkhanate. Hülegu stayed in the region, establishing his court in Iranian lands and beginning the long experiment of Mongol rule over Persia, Azerbaijan, and Iraq. The term Ilkhan implied a subordinate Khan, loyal to the great Khan in Mongolia, but on the ground, Hülegu's realm quickly took on its own logic. Ruling this mixed territory was nothing like commanding a steppe army. Iran and Iraq were densely settled, agriculturally complex, studded with cities, irrigation systems, religious endowments, and scholarly institutions. Taxing them effectively meant understanding existing systems, not just imposing requisitions on herds and pasture. Mongol nobles expected appanages and revenue. Local elites, Persian bureaucrats, urban notables, religious leaders expected some continuity of their privileges and protections. Hülegu and his advisers leaned heavily on experienced administrators from the region. They also faced new tensions. The Ilkhanate court was initially religiously mixed. Buddhists, shamanists, Christians, Muslims all present, and the destruction of Baghdad left a deep wound in Muslim memory. Balancing Mongol aristocratic demands with the need to keep agrarian life functioning became a constant challenge. And before this new order could stabilize, it met its limits in the west. In 1260, a Mongol army operating out of Syria, with some local allies and subject contingents, pushed toward Palestine. They had already taken Aleppo and Damascus. In previous decades, this sort of advance had usually ended with enemy states collapsing or retreating. Instead, at a place called Ain Jalut, they hit something different. The Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt was ruled by a military elite of former slave soldiers who who had risen to power through discipline, training, and their own harsh internal politics. They had studied Mongol methods, they had cavalry of their own, and they had no safe hinterland to retreat to if they lost Syria. For them, resistance was existential at Ain Jalut, Mamluk forces under Sultan Qutuz, and the general Baybars met and defeated a Mongol detachment. The battle was not huge by global standards, and Hulagu himself was not present. He had withdrawn east after Munga's death to be ready for the coming succession struggle, but its psychological and strategic impact was enormous. For the first time, an organised Muslim army in the central Islamic lands had met Mongol invaders in open battle and won decisively. The aura of unstoppable Mongol advance cracked. The Mamluks moved quickly to consolidate Syria under their protection, presenting themselves as defenders of Islam against the destroyers of Baghdad. From then on, the southwest would be a contested zone, not a one-way corridor of conquest. The Ilkhanate would rule Iran and much of Iraq, but the road to Egypt was effectively closed. A boundary had been drawn in blood at Ain Jalut, one that would shape Levantine and Eurasian politics for generations. Behind these events, the larger Mongol world was shifting again. Munki's death had reopened the succession question. While Hulagu tried to secure his new domains, another Ptolemid brother was tightening his grip in the east, drawing the empire's centre of gravity toward China. When Munka died in 1259, he left no neat solution. He died on campaign in China, far from Karakoram, far from Hulagu's new court in Iran, and far from his brother's power bases. The empire that had been held together by his authority suddenly had a hollow centre. On the steppe, that kind of vacuum never stayed empty for long. Among the Ptolemid princes, two figures moved fastest, Kublai and Arik Buke. Kublai was already deep in northern China, running a semi-autonomous command aimed at conquering the southern Song. He had surrounded himself with a mixed circle of advisors, Central Asian commanders who understood steppe politics, and Chinese administrators and scholars who understood how to squeeze revenue from fields and cities without burning them. He had experience levying grain, managing census systems, and negotiating with Chinese elites. His camp felt less like a raiding horde and more like a mobile government. Arik Bok, by contrast, was anchored closer to the old heartland, based around Karakoram and the traditional Mongol power centres in Mongolia. He had the backing of many princes and nobles who distrusted what they saw as Kublai's drift toward Chinese ways. To them, the empire was still supposed to be a steppe empire. Horses, herds, and the Kurultai under open sky, not bureaucrats counting tax registers in Chinese script. When word of Munki's death spread, both brothers moved to claim legitimacy. Arik Bok had geography on his side. He could summon a Kurultai in or near the homeland, attracting nobles who still thought of the steppe as the proper stage for imperial decisions. In 1260, a gathering at Karakoram proclaimed him Great Khan. Kublai, meanwhile, convened his own assembly in the east, at Shangdu in what is now Inner Mongolia. His supporters argued that the empire was no longer just a ring of tribes, but a web of conquered civilizations. The ruler who could actually manage those lands, especially rich North China, had the stronger claim. That council proclaimed Kublai Great Khan. For the first time, there were two Great Khans at once. The Ptolemid civil war had begun. It was not only a clash of armies, it was a clash of visions. Kublai's power base in North China looked different from his grandfather's camp in the 1220s. He relied on Chinese advisors like Liu Bingzhong and the Uyghur administrator Yao Shu, who urged him to present himself not merely as a Mongol conqueror, but as a legitimate Chinese ruler. They encouraged him to repair irrigation systems, lighten some taxes, and show respect to Confucian rituals and temples. Kublai listened selectively. He did not become Chinese. He tried to become something new. In his court, you could find Mongol princes debating strategy in their own language, while scribes recorded decrees in multiple scripts: Mongolian, Chinese, Persian, Tibetan. Chinese institutions, census offices, grain transport systems, examination-trained officials were kept and adapted rather than swept away. Kublai used them to supply his armies and pay his nobles. At the same time, he went out of his way to honour steppe norms. He wore Mongol dress at key moments, maintained the traditional winter and summer camps, held hunts that doubled as political gatherings, and continued the distribution of appanages and shares of tribute to Mongol aristocrats. To calm critics, he framed his adoption of Chinese practices as a tool, not a surrender. Still, every compromise cut both ways. To Chinese literati, he could never be a true son of heaven. To some Mongol nobles, he was already too close to being one. They watched Chinese officials gain influence at court and worried that pasture rights and war booty would be slowly replaced with land taxes and paper registers. As the civil war dragged on, campaigns in Central Asia, skirmishes near Karakoram, shifting loyalties among regional commanders, it exposed a deeper reality. The idea of one unified empire was fraying. Hulegu in Iran, busy stabilizing the Ilkhanate after Ain Jalut, had little reason to obey orders from Arik Bok, and every reason to favour Kublai, who seemed more inclined to respect his autonomy. The princes in the western steppe, the future Golden Horde, weighed their own interests. In Central Asia, the Chagatai domains had their own tensions and grievances. Each region was starting to think of itself as a centre rather than a province. By 1264, Kublai had the upper hand. Arik Boka, starved of supplies and betrayed by wavering allies, surrendered. He was treated with a mix of clemency and control, eventually dying in captivity. On paper, Kublai was now the uncontested Great Khan. In practice, something irreversible had happened. The civil war had taught every major branch of the Mongol royal family that they could survive, even thrive, by prioritizing their own territories. The fiction of a single, tightly run empire was harder to sustain. The Ilkhanate, the Golden Horde, the Chagatai lands, each was drifting. Kublai responded by doubling down on the east. In 1260 he shifted his main capital to what would become Dadu, near modern Beijing. He focused on consolidating North China, preparing for the long, grinding effort against the Southern Song, and crafting a language of rule that Chinese subjects could recognize. That project crystallized in 1271, when he made a symbolic move with far-reaching consequences. He proclaimed the founding of a new dynasty, the Yuan. Taking a dynastic name was more than a branding exercise. In the Chinese political imagination, history was a sequence of dynasties, each claiming the mandate of heaven. By choosing Yuan, a term associated with origin or primordial in classical texts, Kublai signalled that his rule was not a mere occupation. It was, in theory, the start of a legitimate, cosmically sanctioned order. This did a few things at once. To Chinese officials and commoners, it offered a familiar framework. You now lived under the Yuan, just as your grandparents had lived under the Jin or Song. Taxes, corruption, and hardship might continue, but they could be narrated as problems within a dynasty, not chaos outside of one. To Mongol nobles, the new name was mostly a Chinese gloss layered over the old reality. In Mongolian documents, Kublai was still the Great Khan, the successor of Genghis, distributing appanages and expecting military service. The hunts, the feasts, the steppe rituals all continued, even as Chinese court ceremonials multiplied around them. Balancing these worlds was delicate work. Kublai tried to keep Mongols at the top of the military and key administrative posts, while employing large numbers of Central and West Asians, often labelled Simu or various categories in finance and technical roles. Many Chinese held lower and mid-level offices, especially in the countryside. This layered hierarchy preserved Mongol privilege while tapping Chinese expertise. Some policies consciously favoured nomads, limits on Mongols settling into farming, protections for their herds, separate legal systems that judged Mongols differently from Chinese. Others pushed the empire toward Chinese bureaucratic norms. Official histories commissioned, civil offices staffed, formulas of edicts modelled on earlier dynasties. The result was not harmonious, but it was functional enough. As the 1260s turned into the early 1270s, the great Khan, who had once been a warrior prince on the steppe, was now, increasingly, an emperor in a palace, presiding over a court that looked and sounded more Chinese every year. Yet beyond that palace, his cousins ruled Iran, the western steppe, and Central Asia with growing independence. The road to the Yuan dynasty was not just Kublai's personal ascent. It was the story of an empire learning that it could not be one thing everywhere, and of a ruler who chose to anchor his legitimacy in a single, rich, complicated region, rather than in the fading dream of a boundless, undivided steppe world. The conquest of the Southern Song, which would complete that shift, was still underway. By the time Kublai proclaimed the Yuan in 1020-21, the Southern Song had already been living with Mongol pressure for decades. They were not helpless. The Song state had weaknesses on land, political factionalism, cautious generals, and a long habit of defensive war, but it had real strengths on water. Its southern core was draped along the great rivers, especially the Yangtze, that broad, shifting boundary between north and south. If you were a Mongol commander staring at a map in the 1270s, the Yangtze was the problem. To cross it with herds and cavalry was not like crossing the dry valleys of Central Asia. The Song had river forts, watchtowers, chains stretched across channels, and above all war fleets, paddle-wheel ships, armoured towers bristling with crossbowmen, fire weapons ready to turn a boat into a floating furnace, control the river, and you could feed cities, move troops, and deny crossings. Lose it, and the heart of the dynasty lay open. Kublai understood that this would not be a quick raid, followed by the usual negotiated submission. It would be a slow constriction. His commanders, men like Bayan in the field, and Chinese and Khitan specialists in naval warfare, set about building something the early Mongols had never needed: a serious river fleet. Shipyards in North China and along captured stretches of the Hui River worked overtime. Mongol officers oversaw construction, but many of the sailors, craftsmen, and pilots were Chinese, Koreans, and peoples from the south coast, who knew currents, tides, and storms better than any steppe horseman. At the same time, siege technology kept evolving. Engineers from the Islamic world, already famous for their counterweight trebuchets, worked alongside Chinese specialists in gunpowder and fortification. When the Yuan armies surrounded a city now, they brought not only ladders and simple catapults, but heavy stone throwers that could shatter walls, and explosive projectiles that turned night assaults into terrifying storms of sound and light. The campaign unfolded in stages. First, the northern buffer, the old Jin territories and the lands between the Yellow River and the Yangtze, had to be fully secured. Then, step by step, Yuan forces pushed down the river systems that fed into the Yangtze, taking key cities, cutting supply lines, and recruiting or coercing local elites into their administration. The great crossing battles on the Yangtze itself became legends. In some accounts, Song admirals argued for bold strikes, full commitment of the fleet to burn the Mongol transports and throw them back. Other sources preserve a more hesitant tone, court factions in Linan debating whether to risk everything on one decisive engagement or to conserve ships for a long defence. The details differ depending on which chronicle you read. but the pattern is clear. The Song could not afford a mistake. The Yuan could keep trying. Once major crossings were secured and forts on the southern bank fell, the Song position unravelled. City after city opened its gates, sometimes after sieges, sometimes after negotiations in which local officials calculated that survival under new masters was better than loyalty to a doomed court. The Song capital Linnan, modern Hangzhou, eventually faced the reality it had tried to postpone. Sources describe ministers debating whether to flee inland with the young emperor, to organise a last stand at sea, or to surrender and hope for leniency. In 1276 the capital capitulated. The boy emperor was taken into Yuan custody. Some Song loyalists refused to accept the end. They rallied princes, tried to establish courts in the south and along the coast, turned to the sea as their last refuge. Naval clashes continued. One of the most famous final battles near Yaishan in 1279 ends in a cloud of tragedy. Loyalist ships cornered, outnumbered, driven against the shore and rocks. Chroniclers tell of ministers taking the child emperor in their arms and leaping into the water rather than submit. How exactly it unfolded is filtered through layers of memory and sorrow, but what matters for the larger story is simple. The last organised Song resistance died in the waves. For ordinary people, the shift from Song to Yuan was not a single moment but a series of adjustments. Tax registers were revised. Grain shipments that had once moved north under Song officials now moved under Yuan ones. Local gentry, village headmen, and merchant families who chose to cooperate could retain influence, sometimes even expand it, by serving as intermediaries between Mongol authorities and rural communities. Others who had been closely tied to the old regime found themselves sidelined, their estates confiscated or reassigned. Administration became more standardized. Censuses counted households, fields, and mulberry trees. New officials, often non-Han Semu or Mongols, appeared in county seats, overseeing revenue and judicial cases. For peasants, this might mean heavier corvée, or merely a change in whose seal appeared on orders. For some urban artisans and traders, Yuan rule opened pathways to work for a larger empire, whose networks now stretched from the South China Sea to the Black Sea. With the fall of the Southern Song, Kublai's project reached a turning point. For the first time since the Tang, most of what we now call China was under a single dynasty. The Mongol state, which had begun as a loose confederation of steppe clans exploding outward in every direction, now had a consolidated Chinese core. That changed its identity and its priorities. The Yuan court invested more in canals, granaries, and examination-style schooling, even as it kept Mongols at the top of the hierarchy. The image of the ruler tilted further toward that of a Chinese emperor, the son of heaven residing in a fixed capital, while still claiming the title of Great Khan. In practical terms, unifying China gave the Mongols unrivaled access to agricultural wealth, maritime trade, and skilled labour. It also bound them more tightly to the problems of ruling a dense, settled, tax-paying population instead of a shifting frontier of conquests. The storm that had swept in from the steppe was now anchored to a vast agrarian world. That anchoring gave it immense strength. It also made it heavier, slower, and more vulnerable to the kinds of crises, famines, fiscal strain, local rebellions that had ended so many Chinese dynasties before. From a distance, it still looked like one empire. Kublai in his new capital, cousins ruling to the west, messengers riding out with orders sealed in the name of the Great Khan. Maps drawn by later historians often shade it all one colour, as if a single hand could move armies from Korea to the Black Sea. Up close, it was already something else. By the 1260s and 1270s, the Mongol world had sorted itself into 4 great spheres. Not clean, neat boxes, but overlapping circles of power, sometimes cooperating, sometimes colliding, In the east there was the Yuan, Kublai's realm with its Chinese bureaucracy, Buddhist monasteries, Tibetan lamas, and a court that liked drama, poetry, and elaborate ritual almost as much as it liked good cavalry horses. The Yuan claimed the mantle of the great Khan, the universal ruler of all Mongols. On paper, everyone else was supposed to bow. North and west of the Caspian stretched the lands we usually call the Golden Horde, though they themselves spoke of the Ulus of Jochi, the domain of Genghis Khan's eldest son. Its heartlands were the steppes of what is now southern Russia and Kazakhstan, anchored by cities along the Volga like Sarai. There, Turkic and Mongol steppe traditions blended with the commercial rhythms of Rus's towns and Islamic merchant routes coming up from Central Asia and the Caucasus. Between Yuan China and the western Khanates lay the Chagatai Khanate, named for Genghis's second son. It was less a single block than a broad band of oases and pastures from Transoxiana to the Tian Shan. Old cities like Bukhara and Samarkand lay within its sphere, but so did high pastures where herds still moved with the seasons. Chroniclers often describe it as the most Mongol in lifestyle for longest reluctant to give up steppe customs, slower to build a dense bureaucratic state. To the southwest in Iran, Iraq, and parts of Anatolia, Hulegu's descendants ruled the Ilkhanate. Their capital shifted, Tabriz, sometimes Sultaniya, but their problem stayed the same: how to govern old Persian and Arab lands with a new Mongol elite, how to deal with the Mamluks in Egypt, and how to balance loyalty to the great Khan in the east with their own ambitions. All of these states were born from the same conquest shockwave. They shared family ties, steppe law, and a memory of unity under Genghis and ÖGedei, and they were linked by routes that had been hammered open by Mongol armies. Caravans could travel from North China to the Black Sea under variations of the same protection. Paisa tablets, relay stations, passports issued in the name of one Khan, but recognized, at least in theory, by others. Venetian merchants like the Polos, Persian envoys, Armenian princes, Central Asian Sufi masters, all moved through this web of roads, post stations and guarded passes that people later called the Pax Mongolica. But that peace was never universal, and it was never automatic. The four Khanates traded with each other, but they also fought. The Ilkhans and the Golden Horde feuded over the Caucasus and control of trade through the Caspian and Black Sea. The Chagataids argued with both neighbours about border cities and pasture rights. Even within each Khanate, rival branches of the family plotted and occasionally tried to invite outside cousins in as allies. Diplomatic letters from this time can read strangely polite and venomous at once. Flowery greetings, long genealogies tracing shared descent from Genghis, followed by sharp reminders about whose envoys had been insulted, whose merchants had been taxed too heavily, which border fortress really belonged to whom. Religion added another layer, but it did not divide neatly along east-west lines. In the Yuan sphere, Kublai favoured Buddhism and patronised Tibetan lamas, while still respecting Taoist and Confucian institutions and allowing Muslim and Nestorian Christian communities to flourish. His court was a mosaic of beliefs. What mattered most was loyalty and usefulness, not formal creed. In the Western Khanates, Islam's influence grew stronger over time, but on different schedules. Golden Horde elites interacted constantly with Muslim Volga Bulgars and Central Asian traders. Over the late 1200s and early 1300s, more of its ruling class adopted Islam, especially under Khans like Berke and later Ezbeg. Even then, shamanic practices and steppe rituals persisted alongside mosque building and Quranic study. In the Ilkhanate, early rulers like Hulegu were Buddhists or traditional steppe believers with Christian relatives and advisors. Only in the early 1300s, under Ghazan and his successors, did Islam become the formal backbone of the state, bringing with it a surge in Persianate culture and legal reform. The Chagatai Khanate moved unevenly. Some regions Islamized earlier, others clung to older practices for generations. Later rulers would become noted Muslim patrons, but in the 13th century, the religious landscape there was still highly mixed. What held all of this together thinly was shared Mongol DNA, not just literally through intermarriage between ruling houses, but in a common political language. The idea that all legitimate rule flowed from Genghis's lineage, the use of the yasa, the remembered law of the ancestors, the prestige of the steppe way of war, yet that shared inheritance also fueled rivalry. Every branch could claim to be the truest heir, the most faithful guardian of Genghis's legacy. When the centre in Karakorum weakened and Kublai anchored himself in China, other branches felt freer to ignore commands to crown their own Khans without waiting for approval. So the so-called Pax Mongolica was real enough for a merchant on the road between Kashgar and Tabriz, or a scholar travelling from Persia to Dadu. In many regions banditry fell, customs posts were standardized, and long-distance trade reached levels not seen for centuries. It was less real on the frontiers where Horde and Ilkhan troops clashed, or where Chagatai princes raided each other's pastures, or where local rebels tested Mongol garrisons. Always it depended on a fragile balance, family politics, personal alliances, and the ability of individual Khans to keep ambitious relatives in check. As long as that balance held, the road stayed mostly open, the caravans rolled, and distant cities were linked in a shared, if uneasy, world. When it began to fail, the cracks would spread along those same routes. For people living inside that shared world, the changes could feel almost miraculous and a little unnerving. On the best days, the overland routes really were safer than they'd been in a long time. Caravans could cross thousands of miles under the shadow of Mongol authority, moving silk, furs, spices, glassware, paper, and ideas. Post stations fed and sheltered official envoys. Armed escorts could sometimes be hired through awkward negotiations with local commanders. Bandits who struck the wrong caravan might find a Mongol punitive column on their doorstep a few months later. But that safer corridor idea had limits. Protection was always uneven. A road might be calm for 10 years, and then dangerous for 5, depending on which prince was feuding with which cousin. A stamped tablet around your neck didn't help much. If you wandered into a region where the local governor had just rebelled, or if rival Khanates were in one of their periodic trade wars, and suddenly inspection fees turned into thinly veiled robbery. Still, the overall effect was real enough that people moved. Not just goods, people. Mongol rulers had a habit of relocating talent. Artisans from North China found themselves in Central Asian workshops. Persian astronomers ended up advising in Dadu. Metal workers, siege engineers, paper makers and glassblowers could be ordered halfway across the continent to staff a new capital or arsenal. Scholars travelled with them, sometimes by choice, sometimes not. The Ilkhans in Iran drew on Chinese technicians for calendar reform and on local physicians and philosophers steeped in Greek and Islamic traditions. The Yuan court assembled Muslim astronomers, Tibetan lamas, Confucian literati, and Central Asian administrators into a single, if sometimes tense, intellectual stew. Missionaries and holy men made use of the same routes. Franciscan friars walked to Karakorum and beyond. Nestorian Christian communities, long rooted in Central Asia, thrived in some Mongol courts. Sufi orders spread along caravan towns. Each carried not only their scriptures, but stories, rumours and fragments of science and medicine from faraway places. Money and taxes bound it together. In Yuan China, paper money was pushed harder than ever before. Earlier Chinese dynasties had experimented with it, But the Mongol state tried to run large chunks of its economy on printed notes backed, in theory, by state control of key resources. In practice, that meant constant tinkering, new issues of currency, edicts insisting that markets accept paper at fixed rates, attempts to tie it to silver and grain, tax systems that tried to reach farmers in the countryside, merchants in cities and foreign traders at ports, all while funding court luxuries, military campaigns, and a sprawling postal network. Sometimes this worked surprisingly well, especially when harvests were decent and politics relatively calm. At other times, overprinting and corruption eroded trust, and people quietly went back to silver, copper, or barter whenever they could. Commercial experimentation was bold, but it was also risky, and ordinary people felt every success and failure in the price of rice or cloth. Religion inside this world wasn't just belief, it was policy. Mongol rulers often advertised themselves as tolerant patrons. Edicts exempted certain clergy from taxes. Temples, mosques, churches, and monasteries received gifts and land. Chroniclers like to highlight the image of the broad-minded Khan, listening patiently to debates between Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and Taoists. Underneath that, there was calculation. Backing a particular religious community could win support in a newly conquered region. Favouring diverse groups kept any one institution from becoming too powerful. Tolerance usually lasted as long as it suited political needs. When a religious leader crossed a line, even the most open-handed Khan could respond with exile or worse. And moving along those same roads, invisibly, came something else. Disease. Later generations would look back and blame the Mongols for the Black Death, imagining plague rats riding in saddlebags from China to Europe. Modern historians are more cautious. The timing and exact routes are still debated. Some evidence points to Central Asian reservoir zones, perhaps around the Tian Shan or the Caspian, with outbreaks reaching the Black Sea by the mid-1300s. How directly that was tied to Mongol-era trade versus older ecological patterns is still argued over. What's harder to deny is that the web of connectivity, the caravans, the ships linking ports that fed those caravans, the dense markets at their nodes made rapid transmission more likely once an outbreak began. A world stitched together for goods and ideas could, in bad years, also carry pathogens with terrifying speed. If you're curious to go deeper into this connected world, the full story in book form is now available at sleepytimehistory.com, and for this week there's a discount for listeners who want to wander a little further through the Steppe in print. Because life under Mongol rule wasn't just conquest and tribute. It was experiments in money that sometimes worked and sometimes broke. It was scholars comparing star tables from Baghdad and Kaifeng. It was prayers in a dozen languages rising over caravanserai courtyards. And waiting just over the horizon, it was a wave of sickness that would test all of those fragile connections at once. When Kublai Khan died in 1294, the empire he'd hammered together still looked enormous on a map. But its centre of gravity had shifted. Power now lived in palaces, in audience halls, in the quiet offices where edicts were drafted and seals were pressed into wax. And in those rooms, something had changed. Kublai had spent decades building personal authority, balancing steppe chiefs, Chinese officials, Buddhist clerics, and foreign advisors. His successors inherited the institutions, but not the same reservoir of prestige. One after another, Khans climbed onto the dragon throne and slipped off again. Temur, Kublai's grandson, managed a relatively calm reign, in part by not rocking the boat. He held to his grandfather's general policies, reassured the princes, and tried to keep the bureaucratic machinery humming. After him, the pattern grew choppier. Khans died young, were deposed, or never quite ruled without a hand on their shoulder. Factions thickened around the throne. Mongol aristocrats, still powerful in the steppe and in the army, wanted their privileges preserved. Central Asian Muslim administrators pushed for fiscal discipline and tax farming arrangements that made sense to them. Chinese scholar officials argued in memorials for more orthodox Confucian governance, lighter exploitation of the peasantry, and a better moral image for the dynasty. None of these groups was strong enough to rule alone. All of them were strong enough to obstruct each other. So governments shifted like sand. A reformer might gain influence for a few years, issue new currency regulations or land decrees, and then vanish in a coup or a purge. The next regime might reverse everything out of sheer resentment. Underneath these court struggles, the economy was groaning. Paper money, that bold Yuan experiment, depended on confidence. But confidence is fragile. Military expenses mounted. Court patronage, temples, monasteries, noble estates drew increasing shares of revenue. When harvests failed in one province and floods tore through another, the state was expected to ship in grain, rebuild dikes and distribute relief. Sometimes it did. There are records of substantial disaster aid. Warehouses opened and granaries emptied. But each crisis forced a choice: raise more taxes, borrow, devalue the currency, or quietly let some regions fend for themselves. Over time, the easiest lever to pull was the printing block. New issues of notes were declared equal to old ones. Exchange rates were adjusted. Officials were told to accept paper for taxes, and markets were ordered to keep faith. Yet merchants, especially those with silver or foreign connections, could sense the gap between the edicts and reality. They hedged, they hoarded bullion. Prices slid strangely out of line from one region to another. In the countryside, this translated into unease. A peasant who had to pay taxes in official paper but bought salt and tools in a market that preferred silver felt the squeeze twice. Layered over this was the Yuan social hierarchy, which touched every village and alleyway. At the top, Mongols. Below them, a broad category of semu, literally various sorts, which included Central Asians, Persians, and other non-Chinese groups the Mongols favoured for certain posts. Then came the Han from the former Jin territories in North China, and finally the Nanren or Southerners from the old Song lands. It wasn't a rigid caste system in the strict sense, but it shaped access to offices, legal treatment, stipends, and educational opportunities. In practice, this meant that a Mongol or Semu official could sometimes ride rough over local populations with relative impunity. Southerners, still smarting from the conquest, might find themselves paying more taxes, shouldering more corvée labour, and seeing fewer of their own in positions of authority. In some regions, local administrators softened these edges. A Mongol prince might cultivate genuine loyalty by reducing exactions, sponsoring local temples, or protecting communities from predatory officials. Elsewhere, resentment simmered, quiet but enduring. Then the sky itself began to feel hostile. The early 1300s brought waves of floods along the Yellow River, droughts in other zones, and episodes of famine. In Chinese political thought, natural disasters were not just bad luck, they could be read as verdicts on a dynasty's virtue. Scholars muttered in essays and private conversations about heaven's displeasure. Religious leaders framed calamities as signs that moral order had decayed. Among common people, rumours travelled along the same routes as grain and paper money, that the ruling house had lost the mandate, that a new saviour would arise, that the suffering was proof the world had tilted out of balance. Every flood that displaced farmers was also an opportunity for local strongmen to step in, sometimes genuinely to help, sometimes to advance themselves. Gentry lineages, minor warlords, even bandit chiefs could gain legitimacy by doing what the distant court could not: feeding people, organising repairs, enforcing a rough kind of justice. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, central authority thinned. Provincial commanders grew more independent, some diverted taxes to their own troops. Others built personal networks that mattered more than edicts from Dadu. Local landlords hired private militias, secret societies, millenarian sects, and wandering preachers wove together religious hope and social grievance. From the court's perspective, it could still issue commands to the corners of the realm. On the ground, those commands arrived late, or were selectively obeyed or quietly ignored. By the mid-1300s, the Yuan state was still there on paper, on maps, on coins, in the seals of its officials. But its grip had loosened. The world Kublai had claimed was fraying into regions with their own centres of gravity, their own stories about what had gone wrong, and their own ideas about what needed to come next. By the time the first red turban banners appeared, the Yuan dynasty was already hollowed out. The name Red Turban makes them sound like a single unified movement. In reality, it was a patchwork of uprisings, local militias, religious sects, and desperate people pulled together by shared stories more than central command. Many of these rebels drew on a mix of Buddhist and Manichaean teachings, especially the White Lotus tradition. Preachers spoke of the future Buddha Maitreya, of a coming age when suffering would end and unjust rulers would fall. They promised that heaven was changing its mind. For peasants battered by taxes, floods and banditry, that wasn't abstract theology. It was a lifeline in 1351. A massive Yellow River project gave discontent a focus. Thousands of labourers were conscripted to repair dikes and canals. The work was brutal. Corruption was obvious. And among the crowds, organisers whispered that the time had come. They tied red cloth around their heads, a simple sign that meant many things at once: membership, defiance, and a shared belief that the existing order had lost its right to rule. Rebellion spread along the waterways and through the famine zones. Fortified towns changed hands. Local magnates hedged their bets, quietly supporting insurgents, while still paying lip service to the Yuan court. Some red turban leaders were idealists. Others were simply strongmen who saw an opening. One of the men who would rise from this chaos wasn't born a general or a noble. Zhu Yuanzhang began life as a poor peasant in Anhui. Famine killed much of his family. He survived by entering a Buddhist monastery, then wandering as a beggar when the monastery itself could no longer feed its monks. When he joined the Red Turbans, he was just one more recruit, but he had a talent for navigating both battlefield and back room. He listened, watched factions form and break, learned when to obey and when to quietly do something else. Over time, Zhu distanced himself from the more radical religious elements and presented his cause in orthodox Confucian terms, restoring order, protecting the people, honouring heaven's mandate. He attracted scholars who could write proclamations in the right style, and generals who could actually win sieges. Step by step, he took cities along the Yangtze. He made Nanjing his base. He built grain depots, disciplined his troops, treated surrendered populations with enough restraint that word spread. Better Zhu's army than anyone else's. The Yuan court, watching this from Dadu, issued decrees, appointed new commanders, launched counteroffensives. But for each rebel band crushed, another rose, and Zhu was not just surviving, he was consolidating. By the mid-1360s he had defeated rival Red Turban leaders, neutralized powerful warlords and begun to frame his struggle not as a rebellion, but as a dynastic transition. He claimed that heaven had withdrawn its favour from the Mongol house and was now investing it in his. In 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang proclaimed a new dynasty, the Ming. With that declaration he sent armies north. For Mongol rulers the threat was no longer distant rumour. It was marching up the Grand Canal. Defences around Dadu were still formidable on paper. There were fortifications, garrisons, lines of communication to the steppe. But the intangible things that keep an empire together, confidence, loyalty, a sense of inevitability, were gone. Officials debated whether to fight for the capital or preserve the dynasty by retreating. Some advocated negotiation. Others argued that losing Dadu would be a temporary setback as long as the ruling house and key regalia survived. Ultimately, the decision was made. The city would be abandoned. In a move that mirrored earlier steppe strategies, the Yuan court gathered up what it could: treasures, records, the imperial seals that symbolized authority, and rode north. Dadu fell to Ming forces. The city would be renamed Beijing, and in time become the permanent capital of a Chinese dynasty that defined itself in contrast to Mongol rule. On Chinese timelines, 13368 marks a clean break. Yuan ends, Ming begins. But from the Mongol point of view, the story looked different. The rulers who fled re-established themselves in the north, in what is now Inner Mongolia and beyond. They continued to use the dynastic title Yuan. They maintained court rituals, issued edicts, and claimed, with some justification from their own legal tradition, that they were still the legitimate heirs of Kublai's line. Historians later called this the Northern Yuan. It never again controlled the rich river valleys of the south, but it remained a political force on the steppe for centuries, raiding, trading, or lying, and sometimes threatening the very Ming state that had pushed it out of China proper. So in 1368, something ended, and something did not. What ended was Mongol rule as a Chinese imperial house, the experiment of a steppe dynasty seated in the old heartland, claiming the mandate of heaven in the language of the classics. What did not end was the broader Mongol political world, the Khanates in Persia and Central Asia, the Golden Horde on the Volga, the northern Yuan in the steppe lands north of the Great Wall. They had been diverging for decades. By the late 1300s, they no longer formed a single empire, but they still shared diplomatic habits, kinship ties, and a common memory of conquest. The Mongol moment in China left deep marks. In governance, Yuan rulers imported and modified institutions, formalized provincial structures, central secretariats, a more integrated system for moving documents, grain and troops across vast distances. The Ming would loudly condemn Mongol misrule, but quietly keep many administrative innovations that made sense for governing a large, diverse empire. In trade, the Pax Mongolica had pulled Eurasia together. Caravans had moved relatively safely from the Mediterranean to the China Sea. Knowledge, technologies and diseases travelled along the same roads. After 1368, the political map fractured further, but the roots didn't vanish. Merchant families, Sufi orders, Nestorian and later Muslim communities maintained networks that had first flourished under Mongol patronage. Even as Chinese dynasties turned inward or outward in cycles, the idea that the world beyond the passes was reachable and knowable had taken root. In military practice too, the influence lingered. Chinese armies had already known cavalry, but Mongol warfare refined the art of mobile operations, coordinated wings, feigned retreats, deep raids, and complex signalling. Later Chinese states, including the Ming and Qing, continued to study and adapt steppe tactics. They hired steppe horsemen, built fortified lines with an eye toward mounted enemies, and never forgot that power on the northern frontier could still strike hard and fast. Perhaps the most intangible legacy lay in intercultural contact. Under the Yuan, Persian astronomers worked in observatories near Chinese scholars. Central Asian doctors practiced in Chinese cities. Art motifs from Islamic architecture appeared in Chinese ceramics, while Chinese techniques filtered west. Even if many of these connections narrowed after the fall, the memory of them remained in texts, objects, and stories. Modern interpretations of all this diverge sharply. Some historians emphasize Mongol brutality, the massacres of conquest, the upheavals and demographic shocks. Others highlight connectivity, the movement of ideas, plants, inventions, and people that reshaped the old world. In China, the Yuan period has been read in different ways at different times, as a shameful interlude of foreign domination, as a necessary stage in the long arc of Chinese state formation, as an era that, despite its violence, helped knit together regions that later dynasties would govern. In Mongolia, Genghis Khan and his descendants are remembered very differently, as nation founders, as symbols of resilience and unity on the steppe. Outside both regions, the Mongols appear in popular imagination as everything from apocalyptic destroyers to unexpected patrons of global exchange. Part of why the story remains so contested is that it sits at the intersection of so many identities and so many later agendas. Empires that followed the Mongols defined themselves partly against them, partly through them. Modern nations map their origins onto or around that 13th and 14th century storm. And yet, if you strip away later judgments, one thing remains clear. In just a few generations, horse-born warriors from a harsh grassland stitched together a continent-spanning network, shattered old orders, and left behind new patterns of rule, war, trade, and thought. By 1368, the banners over Dadu had changed. The great Khan's seal no longer commanded the rice fields of the Yangtze or the markets of the south, but in the echo of hooves on the steppe, in the routes still traced by merchants and memories, the Mongol age was not so easily closed. The empire had fallen. Its shadow continued on. If you follow that shadow back to its source, you end up on a windy plateau in 1206, at a gathering of chieftains who agreed, for once, not to tear each other apart. From that decision, a straight line is impossible to draw. The story from unification to 1368 is not a smooth rise and fall, but a series of experiments. A man who had lived his whole life in a felt tent tried to turn a moving camp into a permanent capital. An empire built on speed tried to learn how to sit still. Again and again, the same tensions surfaced. Mobility gave the Mongols their power. Horses, herds, and the freedom to shift with the seasons made them almost impossible to pin down. But ruling cities, canals, and rice fields demanded the opposite. Fixed tax districts, offices that stayed put, archives that didn't ride away when the grass failed. Each great Khan had to choose how much of the steppe to keep and how much to trade for ledgers and walls. Unity was another fragile thread. The empire's strength came from a single command structure, a belief that all authority flowed from the family of Genghis Khan. But that same family multiplied. Brothers, sons, cousins, widows with their own factions. The more they conquered, the more there was to inherit, and the sharper the arguments grew. By 1368, what had begun as one campfire had become many, each insisting it was the true continuation of the flame. Conquest opened doors. It also created problems that arrows couldn't solve. It's one thing to topple a dynasty. It's another to repair a dike, negotiate grain prices, and keep distant markets supplied. The Mongols learned, sometimes brutally, that governing meant listening to bureaucrats as well as generals, that an empire could starve even while its armies were undefeated. When distant regions were pulled into the same web, history itself shifted. Ideas that once took centuries to wander from one end of Eurasia to the other could now move in a single lifetime. A craft technique invented in one oasis might appear in a city thousands of miles away. Religious stories crossed language barriers, changed shape, and came back transformed. Plagues, too, moved along these new paths, reminding everyone that connection is never cost-free. But along those same routes, people who would never meet in person began to affect each other's lives. A decision in Karakoram or Dadu could alter the price of spices in Cairo. or the safety of a caravan in the Crimea. The world did not yet think of itself as one system, but it was behaving more and more like one. The Mongol age did not create global history on its own. Earlier and later networks mattered too. Yet between 1206 and 1368, the steppe became a hinge, and when it swung, continents moved closer. As you lie here listening across that long distance, you are connected to those changes in quiet ways. In the food you eat, the words your language borrowed, the maps in your mind of where far away begins and ends. If this journey through the Mongol centuries has kept you company tonight, I invite you gently to help it reach others. When you wake, or if you're still drifting on the edge of sleep, you can tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe for more slow, detailed histories. If you feel like sharing, you might write where you're listening from, what city, what countryside, what corner of the world the echo of the steppe has reached. And if you'd like to wander even farther back in time, into the deep past before empires, there's a book waiting for you. It explores the prehistoric secrets we touched on at the beginning of this channel's journey. Bottlenecks, ancient peoples, the long, fragile thread that leads to us. You can read more about it and, if you wish, pick up a copy at sleepytimehistory.com. For now, let the hooves grow faint, the campfires burn low, and the steppe fade into the distance. The story will still be there the next time you come looking.